Hello, everyone. This is Thersites the Historian. I'm joined this evening by Sean Chick. The topic of this evening's conversation will be none other than William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the most famous commanders from the American Civil War. He was later, of course, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army during many of the Indian Wars. So, tonight to talk about Mr. Sherman is Sean Chick. So, Sean, how's it going?
It's going all right. It's going pretty good. I have to say, of course, I wanted to do this topic because I just got done reading like the fourth Sherman biography that I've read. So yeah, as you can tell, I have some interest in this guy. And what I'd like to do tonight is not just go over like how his life went. I mean, you can read that on Wikipedia or a biography, but analyze some of the decisions he made, his personality, and relationships in his life, but also talk about the guy's legacy, if you will, both for the Civil War, for American culture, and also just for military thought in general. Because he is my favorite American Civil War general, and I also consider him to be one of the very weirdest ones too.
Sure.
You know, you know what I'm saying? Like he's a very, very unusual guy. So
Right.
anyway, do you have any preliminary thoughts you want to do before we get in this one?
I don't have too many particular thoughts about Sherman. I mean, I know he was one of the more controversial figures of the era, especially after the war, due to the march through Georgia and the march to the march to the march to the sea, and then the march to the Carolinas.
Yeah.
But I guess until I really got more into him, reading the thing you wrote on him and having some of these conversations with you about Civil War generals, I never really realized the degree of complexity involved with Sherman's personality, because the only two things I've ever read where he figures prominently, I read a book on the Atlanta campaign, and then I read a book on the Battle of Bentonville. And the latter book didn't really go into Sherman's personality too much, since the battle was basically fought by his vanguard and he just kind of showed up at the last minute.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah, but Bentonville you did because of the North Carolina connection, right?
Yeah, my dad happened to have the book, and I just read it, and I always assumed it was a bigger deal than it was, because it's the sort of last official battle of the war, at least the last real battle. Although it's kind of a shit show of a battle, because the Confederates were not terribly organized. The entire wing under Bragg refused to move, and then because of that, it was basically just a skirmish.
I guess the battle's less bloody. I mean, I know we're already skipping ahead to Bentonville here, right? But the battle is less bloody than it should have been, considering the number of forces engaged. But I wouldn't call it a skirmish either. It is an unusual battle, sometimes called the last field battle of the Civil War. There's some truth in that. I mean, they're fighting like Fort Stedman, Sailor's Creek, Five Forks, but Bentonville, they didn't really have fortifications weren't heavily used. So Bentonville was like a throwback battle. You know, it kind of seems more like Antietam or Second Manassas than it does the 64 to 65 battles, which almost always feature in fortifications. You know, I'm not saying there weren't any fortifications there. I'm just saying that it was a much more freewheeling battle in that regard. You know, so it's really kind of a throwback. But we'll get to Bentonville a bit later then. So I'll go a quick overview, going through Sherman's life, but then adding my own notes as I go along. So Sherman is born to his father, Charles Robert Sherman, who was who'd moved to Ohio and was doing pretty well, fairly prominent in Ohio, very well liked. However, he died. Now, before dying, he, of course, had this son who he did not name William Tecumseh Sherman. He actually named him Tecumseh Sherman.
Oh, wow, that's
Because
a
even
bold
though he fought,
decision, given that Tecumseh was one of the Indians who resisted the settlement of Ohio.
yes, exactly. People thought that his admiration for him was bizarre. And Charles Robert Sherman was well liked, but he was known to be a bit eccentric. And this should be kept in mind that mental illness cut through this bloodline all the way through. Like Sherman's mother never recovered from his death, and essentially she couldn't really raise the children, so Sherman's going to end up being raised by the Ewing family. But I mention this because his father had these eccentricities, and one of them was he just liked Tecumseh a lot. Which, yeah, you're right. He had resisted settling Ohio. It's a weird choice. And don't be wrong, it should be understood that at this time, the natives, the indigenous, have a lot of sympathizers in America, which we'll get into when we talk about what Sherman did after the Civil War in particular. But they tended to be in the eastern cities. So, for instance, Osceola, the great Seminole war chief, when he was captured, he was brought to Charleston. Do you know what he did in Charleston? He attended the opera and ate fine dinners. Because people in Charleston thought, this guy's pretty cool, and which the people who are really the ones who are like, let's go kill some Indians, tend to be the settlers, because they're the ones who want the land, they're the ones who are in harm's way. That is where the more genocidal tendency comes from. But we'll get to the complications with that after the Civil War. Just know that this was a weird choice. And when Sherman gets baptized Catholic, he is baptized Catholic, I found out. It was on St. William's Day, and they wanted to give him a more Christian name. So there he then becomes William Tecumseh Sherman. He was chosen by the head of the Ewing family, Thomas Ewing, because he wanted the boy who was considered the most intelligent, and they went with William Tecumseh. He grows up in their household. This is very important for him because the Ewings are going to turn to one of the most powerful Whig political families in America. Like, you had several political families that were very prominent. The two big ones, though, would be the Blairs and the Ewings at this time. And Thomas Ewing, for instance, is, I believe, the first Secretary of the Interior. And Thomas Ewing also represented a, a conservative Whig political philosophy, which Sherman will adhere to as well. Now, that's the thing to know about Sherman, by the way. He does not like democracy. Like, he sees it as mob rule. He is obsessed with things like order. In fact, there's actually a book called Sherman, A Soldier's Passion for Order, which I've never read, but that's considered one of the best biographies on him. So very much a political conservative, anti-democratic. Sherman eventually will be sent to West Point. He does very well at West Point in just about every way. He gets good grades, but he was somebody who, while he was paying attention to his work, he knew how to have fun, which was important. This also made him fairly popular with his fellow cadets. So Sherman, while at West Point, gets a lot of friends and connections. And I believe that's also very important because when the Mexican-American War happens, Sherman does not see combat. In fact, a lot of Sherman's military career in the Army before the Civil War is a lot of missteps, if you will. So, for instance, his first big assignment is he's sent down to Florida during the Seminole War. By the time he gets there, the thing's almost over. And he then does some garrison work in Charleston. He's sent off to California. By the time he arrives in California, it's already been taken over by the Americans. He played an important part in the gold rush at the time as well. He's one of the guys who helped identify that gold was there. And that's actually how he eventually gets involved in banking on the West Coast. Now, he's also, by this time, married Ellen Ewing, who he grew up with. So that seems kind of weird, don't you think?
Yeah, because normally people don't feel very much physical attraction to somebody they grew up with. At least not from an early age. I mean, they think of them too much like a sibling.
Yeah. No, they got married and would have several children. One of the things that was a real big bone of contention for them was the fact that Ellen Ewing was very, very, very Catholic. All right. And she raised all the kids Catholic. Sherman is essentially a deist. He most certainly wasn't an atheist, but he did not hold much faith in religion, and definitely not the Catholic faith for sure. So they did not have a great marriage for the most part.
So
it wasn't that
did his wife tell the kids a bunch of sort of traditional Catholic stuff and then add "Don't ask your father"? Just trust me on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that. It's the big tension that runs through his entire family. Is that he's married to a devout Catholic and he himself is vaguely anti-Catholic. How the hell do you make that work?
I don't know, but also it's interesting though that he grew up in the household, so I guess it must not have rubbed off on him, either that or his religious views were already somewhat fixed by the time the Ewings took him in.
Yeah, it's for me that part of his personality is sometimes a little hard to understand, given the experience he grew up in, and also the fact that he held the Ewings in high regard. He really looked up to Thomas Ewing, and he definitely, I would say, adopted Thomas Ewing's overall political beliefs. Which essentially, I would classify Sherman a conservative Whig, a very conservative Whig.
So you think maybe that he resisted that one part of the Ewing belief systems, that way he retained his Sherman identity, kind of like a way to sort of pay homage to his adopted family by adopting their politics, but maintaining his own individuality by keeping his own religious views?
I think that's actually a great observation, because Sherman, despite having this powerful political family, did not really go to them for favors. He would occasionally when he was in like a really bad spot, right? But overall, he was hell bent on being like, I will make my own way, which in some ways is a bit silly. Of course, being the fact that he grew up in the household, the Ewings are the ones who get him the position to West Point. That's very important to keep in mind too. All generals in the Civil War are political to one degree or another. You don't just go to West Point. You have to be appointed by politicians. So they're doing this like a favor for friends a lot of times,
Yeah, so, I mean, at worst, your dad has powerful friends.
Yeah, at worst. I mean, an example of this would be Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson's family was not like super politically prominent, but they had connections. Now, Jackson himself actually came from the poorer side of the family. But think about that. The better off half were like, hey, let's go help out our poor relative, Thomas Jackson, and send him to West Point. So anyway, though that if you're going to West Point, you've got some kind of political connections. And Sherman just happens to have them in spades. But at the same time, Sherman did not want to overuse those connections. He wants to make his own way. So I think that's a good observation you have there. I think he also wanted to be essentially flexible about that kind of things. And that's probably one of the things I like best about Sherman overall is his flexibility. This is not a rigid thinker, an erratic thinker, and has a very erratic career, as we're going to see, especially when we get to the war. But anyway, so Sherman has this. I mean, the relationship's also weird too, because Sherman himself was intelligent. He's well read. He loved going to the theater. He liked actually being around artists and actresses and whatnot. And Ellen just wasn't like a very intelligent or inquisitive woman. So it's hard sometimes for me to like understand like what brought them together. And I do think that at least in the early part of the marriage, and then definitely during the war, there was a heartfelt emotional connection there, because some of their letters to each other are quite poignant and beautiful. But
I wonder if it was that partly he needed the estate, but then also, but also not beyond that. I mean, from what you've described, Sherman sometimes could. I mean, at least he strikes me as someone who maybe felt alone even if he wasn't. So maybe the fact that he knows that she had feelings for him meant that he was her kind of woman. Or she was his kind of woman, excuse me, I messed that up.
I could see that. Sherman always wanted adulation and respect. And so much of his life was him pursuing those things, with also at the same time that dread fear of mental illness. And make no mistake about it, Sherman does have mental and emotional problems that almost destroy his career in the war. Anyway, Sherman through the 1850s is kind of just, I mean, at one time he's a Missouri lawyer. What else did he do? He was a banker in California. That failed. Nothing seemed to work. Well, one time he wrote a letter to Don Carlos Buell, who was working in D.C. at the time. And Buell and him were friends, and he was asking Buell for a position in the Army. Buell said, I don't have anything for you, but there's a military academy in Louisiana that will be happy to have you. Now, Sherman had I'd say of all the complicated relationships he had with people, the South and Southerners had to be the most complicated. Understand, Sherman wrote a lot. He contradicted himself. A lot of things depend on how he felt at the time. But, I mean, if you want to find horrible quotes about a group of people, you can find it for just about everybody. I mean, Sherman, of course, notoriously did not like the indigenous. Did not, very, very racist views, didn't really have too many problems with slavery overall. Didn't like Jews. I found that out as well. And Southerners, he had this weird thing. He considered a lot of the planetary elite frivolous and lazy. And his main beef with slavery wasn't that these people are enslaved. It was that it made these people frivolous and lazy. At the same time, he also kind of liked some of their aristocratic pretensions. And he did seem to have an admiration for what you might call a rough type of Southerner, which would be epitomized by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Sherman very famously had an extremely high opinion of Forrest as a military commander. And that particular type of Southerner he viewed as the most dangerous and therefore the one he respected the most. So while he's in Louisiana, he actually makes a lot of friends. He's fairly popular. He had also been able to secure the position through the help of Beauregard, but more importantly, Braxton Bragg, who was a friend of his from their garrison work in Charleston, South Carolina. While in Louisiana, the secession craze is coming. Sherman absolutely opposes it. Some of it's just nationalism, patriotism, but a lot of it, I would say, is also he believes the South is about to do something stupid, something disorderly. And that they're gonna start a war that they can't win. And this is one of the more brilliant parts about Sherman is a lot of people analyzing the Civil War when it starts thinks the North is going to have a much harder time winning it because of the geographic size of the South. But Sherman accurately says that the North has, of course, all of its superiority in factories and ship capabilities, but he's also one of the first guys to really grasp how the railroad is radically transforming warfare. So you have Sherman's overall strategic assessment of the war at the very beginning is very accurate. He says it's going to take 3 to 4 years, that the casualties are going to be horrendous, but the South will lose. He never doubts that for a minute. He may doubt a certain military operation, especially in 1861, but he's very sure the North is going to win. But here's what I think is interesting, what I've just found out. Sherman did not rush to join the U.S. Army when the Civil War started. He hated the politicians of the time so much, North and South, that he wrote and told just everybody around him that what the country really needed was a military dictatorship and that he thought one was inevitable, that the politicians were so incompetent that they would screw up the opening of the war and then the army would have to come in and take things over.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder
so he
if
didn't
Lincoln
actually
ever found out about those letters.
Lincoln probably had some inklings. Now, here's one of the things, too. At the same time, Sherman's brother is becoming a United States Senator from Ohio. We talked about him with the James Garfield assassination. He had that great nickname, the Ohio Icicle.
Yeah, it's a pretty good nickname.
Pretty good nickname. It conveys what he is, I guess. But John Sherman really benefited from the fact that he was an early supporter of Lincoln's nomination. So he's not friends with Lincoln, but Lincoln is very much like, hey, you're one of the first prominent politicians to support me. So he has, I wouldn't say necessarily has Lincoln's ear, but he can speak with Lincoln. And John Sherman essentially, at this point, when Tecumseh Sherman's actually in St. Louis, Missouri at the time. John Sherman says, why don't you come to Washington, D.C. and meet Lincoln? It's one of my favorite, because Sherman was so good with language. That's one of the reasons, and he's so quotable. His letters are great. His memoirs are amazing. And he can really turn a phrase. So apparently Lincoln asked him, because he's like, he just came back from Louisiana. So he's like, so how are things in Louisiana? He said, oh, it's going swimmingly. They're preparing for war. And Sherman came away from that meeting with Lincoln very unimpressed. Lincoln didn't offer him a military position at that very moment. And he just thought that he essentially thought Lincoln was just like a bumpkin incompetent who was probably going to lose the war. And you'll see that in his letters almost to the very end. He's like, this guy Lincoln's an idiot. So eventually there was actually a movement to make Sherman the commander of the troops in Ohio that were massing. He turned it down. He will eventually, though, agree to come on, and he will lead a brigade at First Bull Run. This is the only battle in the Eastern Theater that he'll be involved in. His service at Bull Run is controversial. He managed to find a ford at Bull Run that he was able to cross the brigade with. However, his own brigade he committed regiments piecemeal, as many of the guys did. I think his brigade suffered the heaviest losses of any Union brigade at the battle. But Sherman did help lead the rear guard at the end. Afterwards, the men of the brigade absolutely detested him. I think they wrote a petition to have him removed, and it was a total mess. But even you had this brigade commander who's unpopular. He didn't do that well in the battle, and then Lincoln decides to send him to Kentucky. He'll become the second in command to Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was the commander at Fort Sumter, and he was given command of the Union forces massing in the Ohio-Kentucky area. Anderson apparently specifically asked for Sherman and George Thomas.
So why anyway, George Thomas? Because I know Sherman had the connection, but what about George Thomas?
Thomas was just very, very well regarded. Remember, he had been an instructor at West Point. He had experience with cavalry, infantry, and artillery. He had actually just recently suffered a wound in Texas where an arrow had gone through him, and he pulled the arrow out. So tough man. Now, there have been questions about Thomas's loyalty. And kind of like Sherman, Thomas at first didn't take sides in the war. He had actually hurt himself falling off a platform. He himself was a slave owner. And Thomas kind of went into seclusion for a bit, and I think he was mulling things over, but he never really told anybody or sent correspondence out because a famously very private man. In fact, one of the great tragedies is that his letters were destroyed after he died. So, all we have for George Thomas is, whatever you get in the official records and then whatever a person writes about him. But the thing about Thomas is he had a good reputation. There were fears that he shouldn't go to Virginia because being from Virginia himself, there were some ideas that maybe he would hold back there, or you get what I'm trying to say. So there was all kind of this understanding they'd probably send Thomas out west, even though he did do a little bit of service in Virginia. The other thing that helps out, too, is that Sherman and Thomas at this point are friends. They had been friends since, I want to say since the academy. I think they might have even been roommates in West Point. Anyway, so Robert Anderson's only... This is the funny thing, though. When Sherman goes west, he talks with Lincoln, and he says, I'm doing this, but I'm going to be a second in command. Do not make me the commander of an army. And Lincoln apparently joked and said that Sherman was the only officer in the entirety of America who did not want to be in charge of an army, who wanted to be a subordinate.
So he was basically the Hardee of the North.
Well, he does find himself in command of the army, because Anderson resigned after about a month of service. Sherman's tenure in command is... he does improve discipline and organization in the army, but he essentially has a nervous breakdown. Now, there's some historians have said that Sherman didn't go crazy. I'm not saying he went crazy. I am saying, though, that he did start to suffer a nervous breakdown. He thought the Confederates had way more men than they did. He canceled an advance by George Thomas that was going to be made to eastern Kentucky. That was a big fiasco. Newspapers claimed he was insane. He wasn't, but he definitely was suffering emotional problems. And he eventually, Buell replaced him. And I think this might be in some ways where his relationship with Buell sours, because Buell comes in and says, nothing's wrong, everything's fine. So at any rate, Sherman stayed at home. And then Henry Halleck called him in and had him train troops in Missouri and attend strategy conferences. Him and Halleck had been friends. Now, in the case of Halleck, I believe that he sees that he can help out his friend. At the same time, he can cultivate a man who, what do you know, his brother's a senator and his in-laws are the Ewings. Not a bad idea, right?
Yeah, pretty good deal.
Pretty good deal. Sherman is a talent for training soldiers and also for organizing logistics, which he helps do to support Grant. And then Sherman will be given command of an infantry division. One of the most controversial things about Sherman and the command of that division is on the eve of the Battle of Shiloh. Sherman, more than any other officer, is going to ignore just about every sign that there's a Confederate army nearby. Rather aggressively. I think one of his lines is, "The enemy is saucy, but it's just reconnaissance party."
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, like, oh yeah, like there.
Well, that was
he went to
a recon in force, then, I guess, by definition. Pretty major advance at Shiloh.
The problems at Shiloh is, okay, one can say they didn't entrench the position, but to be fair, entrenching was something they weren't used to, and they were emphasizing drill more than entrenching. A lot of these soldiers at Shiloh are pretty raw. The bigger problem is, why are there no sustained probes, if you will? You know, Sherman, Grant, and Prentiss, the Prentiss being the other division commander who's close to where the Confederates are, simply got it into their head that the Confederates would never attack. Some of it was also terrain. Sherman had picked the area because it's not a good campsite, it's got good defensive terrain, which is correct. So Shiloh's weird. If somebody told me, like, rate Sherman at Shiloh, I'd be like, well, before the battle, it's one of the low points of his career. And hilariously, he'll spend the rest of his life telling everybody I wasn't surprised.
Of course.
Now that's some epic level stupidity there, right? On the other hand, in the morning of April 6th, Sherman actually had authorized a major probe with some cavalry. He was riding out in front, and then the Confederates opened fire on him. His orderly nearby was killed. Sherman actually lifted his hand up, and his hand was hit with buckshot. He actually suffered two. That's the minor wound he'll suffer at Shiloh. Anyway, he falls back and organizes a defense. And I would say once that happens, Shiloh actually might be Sherman's best battle in terms of, like, combat command. He's excellent once the fighting starts. Organizes a pretty coherent defense, holds up the Confederates for a few hours, takes part in a counterattack later in the afternoon that caused the Confederates some problems, and then launches his division right back into the fray on April 7th. And while his division doesn't do the greatest, they're kind of chewed up, but it's still kind of a miracle they can do what they do in the first place. And, of course, Sherman gets lots of praise in the newspapers afterwards. Both Grant and Halleck say that Sherman's the hero of Shiloh, which is, in some ways overstated. In many ways, it's Halleck trying to boost a friend, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, though, what was I going to get to? Yeah. So Sherman afterwards gets a promotion to Major General and will eventually lead the men who occupy Memphis. So he'll kind of be like the governor of Memphis for a few months. At this point in the war, by the way, Sherman very much opposes the hard war policies he's famous for. And I say hard war, not total war. The Civil War was not a total war. Not by a long shot. But there is a transition in the Union from a soft war to a hard war policy. It should also be kept in mind, though, that that policy was not one of wanton destruction, but one that's rationalized. They think they have to do a certain amount of economic damage to the Confederacy to defeat them, but they don't want to do so much to where reconciliation and reunification is impossible. That part's very important, because it's going to explain what Sherman does in the closing weeks of the conflict. Anyway, I guess at this point it's worth talking about his relationship with Grant, but you got any questions or observations?
Not really, no. Can't really think of too much to add.
Yeah, okay. Relationship with Grant is very interesting. I mean, you have a book That's like Grant and Sherman, the relationship that won the Civil War. And I think a lot of people discuss the relationship between the two men simplified as in like they're best friends. I'm like, there's some complicated stuff going on here. On the one hand, what Grant liked is that Sherman was very much like, I'll do whatever I can to help you. And this is like when Grant is at Fort Donelson. Sherman was the one forwarding supplies. At the same time, Grant knows that Sherman is one of Halleck's favorites. And Grant by this time knows that Halleck doesn't like him. Halleck had him removed. And I believe that Grant made a conscious decision to make it to where if Halleck liked anybody, he would try to win them over. And an example of that is Sherman, also James McPherson, Charles F. Smith, and another one would be to a lesser degree Stephen Hurlbut. And if you look at it, if Halleck disliked an officer, so did Grant. So I believe that Grant very consciously was like, I want to win my superior over, befriend these men. Now, that doesn't mean that Grant's friendship with Sherman was fake. I'm just saying that I think that might have been the original impetus for him being nice and friendly with Sherman.
Right.
Right? But as it goes on, it does become a deep relationship, which is also a very odd one since they're very different men. I mean, Sherman's like a thin, can't stop talking. You know, Grant's not fat, if you know what I mean, but he's a little bit stockier. He doesn't talk that much, really. I remember reading that thing that Grant one time told Roscoe Conkling that he said, when I don't like a man, I don't like to tell him that. Sherman would tell you, of course.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's why his letters are fine. He doesn't hold back. Anyway, let me get a swig of water here real quick. All right. So anyway, there's a story that Grant was considering resigning from the army, and Sherman convinced him to stay on. Some people question that story. I think that Sherman gave Grant support after Shiloh that other officers were not necessarily giving him. Halleck, for one. Halleck's relationship to Grant is very weird because Halleck, in the end, thought Grant had abilities, but also thought he had severe weaknesses. And it wasn't until Vicksburg that he said, "Okay, Grant, you're my man." You know, which once again helps if all your friends are like, "Hey, we like Grant," you know. But the other thing to keep in mind is that Sherman definitely believed he was Grant's like intellectual superior, and he could be very critical of some of Grant's decisions militarily. Now, Sherman would also say, like, you know, I'm always scared the enemy's going to do, but Grant isn't. That's what makes him great. So he did praise Grant a lot in the letters. But that's important to keep in mind. With no officer was Sherman, like, completely, like, oh, they're the greatest thing ever. Like, he has good and bad things to say about a lot of these men. Halleck, McClellan, Thomas, Grant. But at any rate, Sherman essentially becomes Grant's confidant and right-hand man. And that's going to lead to the Vicksburg campaign. Now, at this time, Sherman becomes a corps commander. I would argue that this is the position he was worst at. He did not turn out to be a great corps commander. At any rate, his first independent action is when Grant sends him to take Vicksburg before McClernand can. Sherman lands, attacks Chickasaw Bayou. His men are repulsed. It's not a major defeat, but it's a considerable enough one. McClernand arrives. Now he's in command. Then McClernand and Sherman, they got along at first. Now they don't really like each other, but they somehow both decide, you know what? Let's go take Fort Heiman in Arkansas. And they do, and they manage to capture the garrison. Now, because McClernand did that, Grant denigrates the achievement, but it's one of the only unabashed Northern victories at this time. So, you know, it's wildly hailed, and this is actually probably Sherman's best action as a corps commander. In the Vicksburg campaign itself, Sherman opposed the plan that actually led to the capture of the city, where they would land below Vicksburg and march through the interior and then come over to the city and besiege it. He opposed that overall plan. I think that might be one of the reasons why Grant didn't have him land and do the marching. Instead, he had McClernand do it, and I believe that one reason might have been McClernand was the biggest supporter of the plan. So if you're going to carry it out, get the guy who wants to do it the most. At least that's a little theory I have.
That makes sense.
Anyway, yeah, it does. There's also positional stuff too. The way the corps were, it was easier for McClernand to get down there. Sherman, though, did do a successful diversion operation. He did win the small battle at Jackson. And during the operations, he was given an independent force which monitored and then chased off Joseph E. Johnston's relief army, and then retook Jackson, Mississippi again. After that, tragedy strikes for Sherman. His favorite son was Willie. I mean, he loved this boy. And so after Vicksburg, Willie and Ellen come down to the army. Willie catches malaria and dies. He blames himself too, and he and Ellen write. I mean, these are painful letters that they're writing to each other, and they write about it for years afterwards. The death of his favorite son will, of course, haunt Sherman for the rest of his life, and will cause a lot of problems with his other son, Thomas, or probably usually called Tom. By the way, not the only kid he lost. During that visit at Vicksburg, Ellen got pregnant, had another child, and that kid died. Sherman never saw it.
Damn.
He even kind of observed that by that time he had seen so much bloodshed that when he heard about the death of a boy he had never seen, it didn't even affect him that much. So two children dead during the war.
But both within a very short time of each other, too.
Yeah. I want to say the other son's name was Charles, I believe. But anyway, Sherman will lead the 15th Corps in the relief of Chattanooga. This is like his absolute worst performance as a military commander. And some of that has to do with the Depression, of course. But anyway, when Sherman arrives, Grant's like, well, I trust the Army of the Tennessee more than the Army of the Cumberland. They're my own boys. Sherman's my guy. So he orders Sherman to turn the Confederate right flank and take Missionary Ridge. This is so as to drive a wedge between the Confederate Army under Bragg and Longstreet's men, which are moving on Knoxville. Anyway, Sherman takes like a day to cross. Instead of attacking right away, he has his men fortify. He fails to secure local guides. He then attacks the wrong hill and thinks he's taken Missionary Ridge. He attacks a vacant hill and says, hey, I got it. And only to find out, of course, that he's on the wrong hill. Now, Sherman had 16 infantry brigades. Can you guess how many he attacked Missionary Ridge with?
We go with 3.
You're not as generous. It's actually 6, but damn, 3, man.
Oh. Well, I knew by the setup that it was going to be only a fraction of what was available.
What's kind of funny, though, is here's actually more depressing. Do you know how many of those 6 brigades attacked in concert, though? Like, no more than 2 at a time. This is one of the worst assaults I've ever seen in the Civil War. Very, very, very poorly done. So he fails. And then Grant orders Thomas's army to attack the rifle pits at Missionary Ridge. They take those. And upon seeing that, the Army of the Cumberland realizes being in the rifle pits puts them in an exposed position. So nobody gives the order, but some of the brigades just start to charge up the ridge. Now, normally, have you ever seen Missionary Ridge? It's not small.
No,
so everybody in Grant's camp, is like, this is going to fail. But the Confederate defenses were poorly sited. They hadn't even fortified Missionary Ridge completely. Also, the Confederates running up the ridge, they can't shoot to their own men, right? And the Union guys are following right behind. Breckinridge was at command of Missionary Ridge. He actually wasn't present. He was busy moving a brigade to the south. And that is how the Battle of Chattanooga is won. In one of the most crazy, bizarre, and impromptu assaults in all of history.
I guess the assault was pulled off mostly by Thomas's men.
It's all Thomas's men. Which for the Army of the Tennessee, that whole Army of the Tennessee, Army of the Cumberland rivalry, which you can still see in history books written today, That's really bad for the Army of the Tennessee, because the Army of Tennessee, when they got there, they were like, yeah, whatever, you've been besieged, we're here to save your ass. I think the 15th Army Corps' emblem was actually a round, a box that said 40 rounds. That's apparently because some guy arrived there, looked at the Army of the Cumberland, and said, all I need is 40 rounds to go beat the Confederates. Something along those lines. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. But the thing about it is that for all their boasting, it's the Army of the Cumberland that wins the battle and pulls off this insane and amazing assault that nobody really ordered. It's one of the crazier moments in history, or at least military history. Anyway, when the battle's over, Grant praises Sherman and says it was all diversion.
Okay.
Grant's account of the Battle of Chattanooga, it's just him lying through his teeth mostly to make himself and Sherman look good. Now, I will say this though: Peter Cozzens and Joseph Rose. Cozzens has written the main book about Chattanooga, and Rose writes about Grant and Grant Under Fire. They kind of argue that Grant was pointless at Chattanooga. I would not say that. I'd say that Grant did, once again, at Chattanooga, prove himself to be very good at operational and strategic concerns. He knew his main objective was to protect Knoxville, and to do that, he needed to knock Bragg off. And he was flexible in his plans. He ordered a cavalry raid that did help break things up. So while Grant's contributions to winning Chattanooga were vastly overstated by Grant himself, he did make important contributions. No mistake about that. Well, at this point, eventually Grant will become commander of all the armies, and he'll appoint his friend Sherman commander of the Western Theater. Which, to be honest, Sherman really hasn't earned. He hasn't done anything that incredible. If it was a choice purely based on merit, it would have been Thomas. All right. I mean, hell, one can make a case for Rosecrans, but remember, there's nobody Grant hates more in the world than Rosecrans.
Right,
but Sherman is his friend.
Was irrelevant.
Irrelevant, yes. Sherman, though, is his friend. Sherman is still Halleck's friend. Sherman is acceptable. Now, this does come with some problems. Now, one thing I'd like to say about the political generals of the war is the generals who were overtly Republican or Democrats, either they were a Republican or Democratic politician, or they were a general or officer with very pronounced political views. I'm not saying they didn't have success, but they had less than you'd think. The Halleck clique is actually, for the most part, I would say politically moderate. And somebody like Sherman, sure, he has Republican Party connections, but he himself is most certainly not a politician, and his opposition to emancipation holds even in 1864. He in particular is opposed to arming black soldiers. Now, it does happen, he just drags his feet on it. And he also makes sure that his army has no black soldiers in combat roles. None. At all. They will be strictly used for garrison work. Compare that to Grant. Grant will, I think, Grant's not like a hardcore emancipationist, but he brings along a division of black soldiers on the Overland Campaign. Now, they don't actually see major combat until months later, but they're there. They mostly guard the wagon trains, but they are there, and they will eventually be seen major combat. And by the time the war is over, in Virginia, those are the 25th Corps. The 25th Corps is made up almost exclusively of USCT regiments. USCT standing for United States Colored Troops. By contrast, to my knowledge, Sherman doesn't even have a squad of USCT with him through the entirety of his Western campaigns.
I didn't realize that.
When we get to Savannah, I'll mention Sherman with the 40 acres and the mule thing.
Wow.
But before we get into the Georgia campaign, we might want to check some super chats since we're at about the halfway point in discussing where Sherman's at. And we're about to get to the point where he is going to get himself a really good reputation.
All right.
So what do we got? So let's see.
The first one comes to us from C.S. Ventura. He said, "Hope you guys are doing well. Sean, exactly why are you so impressed by the AEF in World War I and compared against the AEF in World War II? What is the difference?"
I would assume he means American Expeditionary Force.
Yeah, which wasn't what it was called in World War II, but I mean, he puts it in quotes, so.
Oh no, I think the AEF, yeah, he did. I was impressed with the AEF, and mind you, I haven't read about the Americans in World War I in a while, but the Meuse-Argonne offensive was very well done. Pershing was able to keep the army together. I also felt that from my research, from my readings, better way to put it, that the Americans in World War I came there and said, okay, we want to learn what you can teach us before we get in there. So I believe it's a good example of an army not just launching itself right in there, but learning the ropes before going in, and that proves to be to their benefit. That said, the American Expeditionary Force in World War II, no, I mean they're good. They learn their lessons, but it should be kept in mind too that they're kind of like tossed into the war with less of that training period, if you will, than what the Americans did in World War I. So I believe that they just were learning like at places like Kasserine Pass, most famously, but in the Italian campaign from them, they're just learning some pretty hard lessons overall. That said, honestly, by the time you get to like the Battle of the Bulge, they're becoming very, very proficient, and they're going to pull off blitzkrieg-style maneuvers in 1945. Granted, it's not like the Germans are in great shape, but they're still fighting hard, you know. And also, I would also add that the Battle of the Bulge, as a defensive battle for the Americans, it's one of their finest hours. So I don't want to sound like I'm being too hard on them. I just mean that it was a steep learning curve, and they got to be thankful they had air superiority and that the Germans had most of their equipment on the Eastern Front. Is all I'm saying.
Mm. All right. Well, next super chat is from Oscar Palacios. $5. Thank you, sir. What are great books about the Civil War? Right now I'm reading about Ariel by Michael Korda. And why do you believe Aurelian the Emperor is so underrated?
You want to go ahead and answer the Aurelian one, and I'll mention one or two Civil War books?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason why Aurelian is not more talked about and why there are fewer books on him than on other emperors is because the sources for that period are not exactly great or abundant. I think that's really what it boils down to. It's hard to really talk about Aurelian at length because you don't really have a lot to draw on. It's clear that what he did was extremely important, though.
Now, for me, refresh me on this one. When did he reign exactly, and what would his achievements be?
He reigned from 270 to 275, and he not only crushed Palmyra, but I believe he also might have crushed the Gallic Empire. So I don't know exactly what the dates are, but anyway, he more or less he restored the empire to being one political unit. And part of that work was started by his predecessor, Claudius II Gothicus, but Aurelian's really the guy who won the victories and did the reunification. But then he didn't really live long enough to enjoy it or to really do the integration, and it took several more years in the rise of Diocletian until the period of the 3rd century crisis ended.
Huh.
But Aurelian is the guy who did the heavy lifting militarily.
Gotcha. On my end, great books about the Civil War can be. It would depend on topics naturally, and I've never been quite happy with a 1-volume history of the war that I've run into. But I think the best one overall on the military side is How the North Won by Archer, Jones, and Hathaway. I think that's still probably the best overall on that scale. Another good one I've read recently was Retreat to Victory, which is about Confederate strategy. I think that's probably my favorite book. That's my favorite book on Civil War strategy. Because he does explain why the Confederates are kind of strategically trapped, to be honest. That they can't do a guerrilla war because that would undo the social fabric, and it's essentially a conservative attempt to preserve a slave society. At the same time, they can't just retreat and abandon territory because that will undermine them politically, domestically, internationally. And also, once again, it's an industrialized war. So George Washington could lose, didn't have manufacturing centers he had to defend necessarily. Now, when I say manufacturing centers, it doesn't mean that George Washington didn't have economic areas to defend. He most certainly did. But there wasn't like, a great arsenal that he couldn't do without. It should also be kept in mind that most of the gunpowder he was using was being imported from France. So the Confederacy has economic nerve centers that must be defended at all costs. Or, so like New Orleans, Nashville, the fact that those two areas fell relatively easily were major blows, for instance. So anyway, retreat to victory, how the North won, those are some good places to start, I would say. But Oscar, if there's any like particular topic you want, if I just leave a comment there and I'll address that for you.
All right. So where were we on the main discussion?
Well, we're getting to the Atlanta campaign, but I think it might be worth mentioning that it's odd that I want to know more about Sherman's relationship with his brother John. We just don't. I'm not saying we don't know a lot. It's just that the two of them could be honest with each other, give each other advice, and help each other out. But I've always felt that it wasn't the most tender of relationships, if you will. Not a tense one, mind you. Just not the most tender relationships, at least from what I've seen. But that said, one interesting thing is that John Sherman himself was not exactly an abolitionist, but he was definitely anti-slavery. And he would write his brother with stuff saying like, "Dude, you need to be a little more like with the times here, with the way where we're going." In fact, I believe John Sherman wrote his brother some letters in 1862, around the time that the hard war policies were going on there, and he's saying like the fact that you're still pursuing a soft war policy means people are speaking ill of you up north. It should also be noted that John Sherman. I was going to say there's a slavery angle, but also John Sherman had much more faith in democracy. For instance, the two just had some very incompatible views. Yet, despite that, and despite not having a particularly warm relationship, they never really bickered, from what I can see. There never was any kind of breach. They pretty much had each other's back, really. But I'd like to know more about that one. So anyway,
and of
Sherman
course
is now.
Brother, somebody pointed out in the chat, his brother ultimately came down a little more on the progressive side. I mean, he was the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Yes, definitely. He's definitely one who's going to be more reform-minded in the Republican Party. For lack of a better term, would represent a progressive faction, I guess. Yeah. I wouldn't call John Sherman, though, a radical Republican. I would call him I think of him as a moderate Republican who is friendlier with radicals than conservatives. But I would not call him, he's not a full-on Benjamin Wade type. All right. But yeah, no, very intelligent man, an underrated figure. I should probably read more about him. And it's kind of interesting, his brother is so much more famous than him, but John Sherman is a major player of this time, not a minor figure by any means. And yeah, of course, we have like the Sherman Antitrust Act, of course.
So you think
anyway,
later on, after the Civil War, that the fame that Sherman won, that his brother was able to capitalize on it at all?
Yeah, to a degree. But I mean, no one ever said that John Sherman lived in his brother's shadow, right? So that should also be kept in mind too. I mean, it definitely does. It helps to have a famous brother, but John Sherman, even without William Tecumseh Sherman, would have been a successful politician. Maybe not quite as successful, but he still would have been a major player. Because remember, he still has the back end of Ewing's. I mean, that's how he gets the position in the first place. Becoming the senator in 1861. But anyway, where were we? Let me think here. Oh, yeah, Atlanta campaign. All right. So Grant's thing is he's going to go into Virginia. He's going to oversee the operations of Meade and Butler. And the attempt there is going to be to destroy Lee's army if possible and also to take Richmond. Both those operations will fail. He can't do either one. Same time, Sherman is to advance on Atlanta. Sherman's actual objective is not Atlanta at this point, though. The objective is simply to pin Johnston down, Joseph E. Johnston, to make sure that Johnston cannot transfer any men to Virginia. Because the obsession for Grant and Sherman is Chickamauga. Because at Chickamauga, the Confederates were able to transfer large numbers of soldiers there, gain a slight numerical superiority at the battle, and win it. And so Chickamauga is interesting. It's this massive bloody battle, right? And it's considered a Confederate victory, but a hollow victory. But for some reason, that battle really haunts Grant and Sherman. So they do not want any kind of troop transfers happening between Johnston and Lee, which, honestly, given Confederate infrastructure, really wasn't that possible. Well, at any rate, Sherman, early in the campaign, is talking about George Thomas. Now, at this time, Thomas and Grant had a very cool relationship. Grant did not trust Thomas, particularly like him that much, but he also didn't outright hate him. He did think that Thomas had some abilities. Sherman's relationship with Thomas is becoming a bit more tense at this time, and Sherman would sometimes say bad things about Thomas, at least in letters to Grant. At the same time, though, Thomas becomes essentially Sherman's advisor. He's the one who oversees the logistics for the operation, for the advance in Atlanta. And Thomas goes to Sherman with a plan. And anybody says that, Thomas was like some unimaginative slow soldier, no, this lays that to rest. His plan is that the one Union army should pin Johnston down at Dalton, and the other one will go through what's called Snake Creek Gap and take Resaca and the railroad, thereby cutting Johnston off from Atlanta. And they had found that Snake Creek Gap was not even being watched by the Confederates. And think about that. The Confederates were hanging out there for months, and Johnston never figured out that one of the passes wasn't guarded. At the same time, Johnston thought that Sherman was actually going to advance on his northern flank, which doesn't make much sense. It would have exposed Chattanooga and would have been off the railroad. Anyway, Sherman approves the plan, but he doesn't have Thomas do it. He has McPherson do it because he wants the Army of Tennessee to get the laurels. He thinks the Army of Tennessee marches faster, and McPherson is his friend. Now, James McPherson, his reputation has gone down quite a bit over the years, at least like his reputation as a military commander.
Right.
McPherson enters Snake Creek Gap and fails to take Resaca. So the master stroke doesn't work out, but it's still essentially a success because even threatening Resaca forces Johnston to retreat. And after that, they're able to push him out of northern Georgia. This is very important, by the way. Sherman was able to force Johnston out of the roughest terrain in Georgia without suffering heavy losses. After that, you'll have weeks of marching and campaigning. There's very few major battles fought. A lot of small battles like Dallas, New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill. The only full-blown battle I would probably say is Kennesaw Mountain. Kennesaw Mountain's kind of born out of a bit of desperation. Well, not desperation, frustration on Sherman's part. What he had been doing was essentially using his superior numbers to march around Johnston's flanks and then forcing Johnston to retreat. Kennesaw Mountain, though, he decides to launch an attack on a heavily fortified Confederate position. The losses are heavy. But, Sherman kind of he tries to validate it by saying, well, we hadn't attacked them frontally. Well, we showed that we're still willing to, so they got to respect us. But at any rate, he pushes Johnston to the gates of Atlanta, doesn't suffer heavy casualties. In fact, the losses between the two armies are roughly equal. Proportionally, they're actually very much a Sherman's advantage. And that's important to keep in mind, too. By avoiding these heavy losses, Sherman made sure that the army was in good condition when it gets there. Unlike Grant and Meade, their armies are shot to pieces when they get to Richmond. But Sherman's is in some ways stronger than it was when the campaign started because he's receiving replacements reinforcements, and also men who were on furlough had returned throughout the campaign. At any rate, Johnston got replaced with John Bell Hood, who of course attacked Sherman at 2 battles, Peachtree Creek and Atlanta. Sherman's handling of these could be as a little bit controversial. In the case of Peachtree Creek, when Hood attacks, Sherman takes advantage of that by marching towards Atlanta, getting very close to it. When Hood launches the attack at Atlanta, somebody apparently advised Sherman, like, hey, why don't we tell Thomas to attack at the same time? And he said, no, this must be the Army of the Tennessee's fight.
What?
So we don't want no stinking help from Thomas.
That's fucking dumb.
We're talking about some petty men. All right. I mean, remember, he gave the Army of the Tennessee the honor of going through Snake Creek Gap. So this is what he wants. It doesn't matter. I mean, the battle's a success. Sherman gives a few vital orders, rallies troops, so it's a victory. What's interesting to me about the Atlanta campaign is that Sherman, for being as blunt as he is, and there were several officers who he had difficult relationships with, particularly Joseph Hooker. It's kind of funny that these guys didn't get into even more bickering, fighting matches than they would. In other words, there's always bickering and backbiting. And there was in Sherman's advance in Atlanta, but it never really caused the Army to become dysfunctional. An example of that is John Logan. John Logan was a political general who temporarily took over command of the Army of the Tennessee when McPherson died. Sherman debated whether to keep Logan. Instead, he puts Howard in charge. Now, Sherman would later allege that one of the reasons is because Thomas said he didn't want either Logan or Hooker in command. He didn't like either guy and didn't want to work with them. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Kind of hard to tell, but it is possible. At any rate, Logan was pissed about that, held it against Sherman, and later got his revenge after the war. But what's interesting is that Logan still remained a corps commander. He took the demotion. It didn't really seem to impede his actions as a commander. So it's interesting that they're able to keep together that much. At any rate, through marching, Atlanta is eventually captured. And at that moment, I guess at that moment, the South's main hope wasn't independence. I think that was gone. But I guess they maybe thought they might get a better peace settlement. Well, that's over now. So yes, Atlanta's fallen, and Lincoln will be reelected. But Hood's army is still intact, and he marches north of Atlanta and forces Sherman to chase him. It's all pretty fruitless. At this point, Sherman deduces that Hood is probably going to invade Tennessee, or at least try to work on northern Georgia. So Sherman spends weeks trying to convince Grant to allow him to march to the sea. Grant will eventually be convinced of that. Sherman's marched to Savannah, and he's got, 60,000 veteran soldiers. There's no serious Confederate opposition. I mean, there's some cavalry, there's some militia, there's a few battles here and there, but nothing can really stop him. Things do get a little dicey as they approach Savannah because the farmland is not exactly the best. But once Sherman gets this connection to the ocean, all's fine. And then he's captured Savannah. At the same time, Hood, of course, marches an army to Tennessee, and it was, wrecked beyond recognition at the battles of Franklin and Nashville.
At the hands of, I think it was, first Schofield and then Thomas?
Yeah. Although I wouldn't give Schofield credit for Franklin. He was across the river and didn't do anything.
Yeah, also, apparently he almost got caught earlier, and if he had been caught that day, then his army might have actually gotten trounced.
Yeah, Schofield got outmarched for a minute. And I'm not saying Schofield didn't do some stuff right. He definitely, he succeeded in the forced march to Franklin. That's one of his best hours as a commander. I'm just saying when the battle was actually being fought, it's more Jacob Cox and David Stanley who are really the guys winning the Battle of Franklin.
Yeah, I've been to Franklin fairly recently, or the summer before the pandemic hit, and I feel like that was one where they literally just stood where they were and fired back because they were on the wrong side of the river.
They did have to do, of course, some maneuvers naturally. Like, I mean, not maneuvers. I mean, like, where do you plug your reserves in, kind of stuff. Um, but anyway, so Sherman will now do the march through South Carolina. Once again, there's no serious opposition. I would say South Carolina
on the loose with the Corps
I wouldn't call it a corps.
or something. I mean, what kind of force did he have? Because I know he was supposed to be the one opposing Sherman this whole time.
Well, sorry. Some cavalry was dispatched to South Carolina, led by Wade Hampton. He had some militia and garrison troops. It really wasn't much. It's not going to be until North Carolina that the Confederates can start to mobilize a semi-coherent defense. But anyway, South Carolina is really the area where Sherman's men do kind of go wild. All right, you're going to have. I mean, they were destructive in Georgia, of course, but in Georgia there was a bit more of a thing about, like, try to target only things that are useful, like, just burn random homes, right? I'm not saying it didn't happen, because it did, but in South Carolina they go wild. It's when they get to North Carolina, Sherman straight up says to him, all right, we got to hold back. He points out that North Carolina didn't secede right away, that North Carolina and South Carolina are different. South Carolina's where the war started. In fact, we could blame it all on these South Carolina aristocrats, which for Sherman's doubly interesting because he had stayed in Charleston as a young officer. He didn't like the planter elite of Charleston at all. So when they're in North Carolina, they start to show restraint again. I think also Sherman realized that his army might be getting out of control, and they need to bring discipline back in. But also, the end game is here. The war is about to end. And that's why I believe that when, Sherman's destructiveness is a targeted event, and when you get to the surrender of Joseph E. Johnston's army, Sherman offers him very generous terms. Very, very generous terms that actually get rejected. And then there's accusations that Sherman's now in cahoots with the Confederates, and he's letting Davis escape and all sorts of stuff, which leads to the thing I spoke to you about last week, about where Sherman, when the army marched up to Washington, D.C. for the Grand Review, Sherman told Halleck, like, don't show your face. My men might shoot you. I can't control them. They get to D.C. He doesn't shake hands with Stanton. And apparently that night there was brawling throughout D.C., and they had to, like, deploy the police to try to break up soldiers. Mostly Sherman's men beating up Easterners, I guess, or, vice versa, too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know there was a real rivalry there, but I didn't know it got to that point.
Yeah, well, Sherman's men actually said they thought he was too generous to the Confederates, but the accusations that he was somehow in cahoots, they just couldn't stand. And that's another transformation that happened. Sherman just was not a popular general with his men until the March to the Sea. He starts to get a sense of humor about him. He starts to kind of loosen up. That's also when some of his racial views get a little looser. And there's an interesting thing he did. Sherman had this thing where he had all these people, escaped slaves with him, his freedmen. And he's kind of wondering, he's like, what am I going to do with them? Because he's like, I can't clothe and feed all of them. More importantly, they're slowing down the march. There's also certain controversies involved, such as like when Union General Jefferson Davis, yes, Union General Jefferson Davis, abandoned thousands of freedmen who were then captured by Wheeler's cavalry. Sherman actually starts giving the properties that have been vacated by their masters. He just starts giving it to them to farm, because his idea is that if you're working and doing something, you're out of my hair. So it's kind of funny that Sherman, one of the least abolitionist Union generals in the Civil War, not only probably did his army free more slaves than any single Union army, he's the one who does the most progressive policy that was probably one of the most progressive policies done for slaves during the whole war, which was giving them land to work back, the whole 40 acres and a mule thing. And that goes back to the idea that Eric Foner had, which is that Reconstruction would have worked if there had been land redistribution, which is a very popular view on Reconstruction. However, I will say that Mark Summers made a very interesting argument against Foner's argument when he mentioned that the problem is the small farms of the South failed throughout the 1870s, whether you were black or white, because of the collapse of the price of cotton. See, a lot of small Southern farmers would get by on the fact that they would have a small cotton field. And then they would sell that off, and that's one of the ways they would stay alive while doing the rest of their farming. But with the price of cotton gone, well, so much for that. And that's when sharecropping really gets popular.
Oh, so that really doesn't become a thing until, what, the late 1870s?
Yeah. And sharecropping, very much a biracial class thing. We had this kind of this idea right now that all sharecroppers had to be black. No, the majority of them are white, actually. So it's really just these people who are farmers who had small farms that they could scrape by suddenly can't. And that's one of the reasons why sharecropping happened in the South. Yeah. So anyway, so at this point, Sherman is acclaimed as one of the great heroes of the North, along with Grant and Thomas. He's considered the triumvirate of generals who won the war. And of course, along with Sheridan, he will be, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan are the three who get the most fame from the end of the war.
The three S's.
Yeah, the three S's, right.
Oh, wait, never mind. Well, I guess U.S. Grant, but still.
Yeah, that's why I agreed. I was like, yeah, the three S's. By the way, fun fact about that. Grant also, Ulysses S. Grant was not his original name. It was Hiram Ulysses Grant.
Yeah, that's not a great name.
He dropped the name. I'm kind of like that. I think they have Hiram Grant. But anyway, he dropped it, So now Sherman, we get into his post-war career. Now, at this point, Sherman is a famous American. And keep it in mind, Sherman had kind of tried to avoid the limelight before, especially because he hated reporters. But now he basks in fame. And now he gets to do the other great task of his life, right? Defeating the indigenous. So he will be given command of the Western forces. He will oversee things like Red Cloud's War, which is famously where the Fetterman party was killed. That was like the worst. That's kind of like a miniature Little Bighorn, if you will. Sherman, when it comes to the Western expansion stuff, Sherman does understand the settlers cause a lot of problems. There are a few tribes that Sherman made fairly, I would say, I don't want to say generous necessarily, but like good peace deals with compared to other tribes. But a lot had to do with what the tribe was doing. So if a tribe had people who were raiding settlers or anything like that, Sherman would react with a vengeance, if you will. He does hold the indigenous to be almost completely inferior. I would actually venture to say that he probably holds them in as much, if not more, contempt than black people. Mexicans would be a close third. Yeah, well, once again, trust me, this guy only likes Northerners. That's what I would say. Northerners who aren't too much into democracy.
So
anyway,
he's got a very narrow preference for allies and friends.
In that regard, yeah. It's anyway. So what's going to happen in the West is Sherman does not favor extermination, but he does favor hard war policies. Essentially, we did it to the Confederates. Let's do it to these people. And keeping in mind too, the thing about those wars, we think about wars with the natives, but the post-Civil War conflicts, they're mostly over within 12 years. And those wars were fairly small. Like, for instance, I want to say from 1865 to about until 1890 with Wounded Knee, the last conflict, if you will, the American army suffered from combat only about 2,000 casualties.
I guess almost half of those were just Little Bighorn.
Little Bighorn would be 1/8 of those, roughly.
Oh.
Yeah, 250 men died at Little Bighorn.
How many
I think
did
the thing.
Reno have?
What'd you say?
How many did Major Reno have?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Because I want
I
to
was
say he
I was
had
reading.
maybe 150 men, and they defended a hill and left after the battle.
I was actually reading up on Major Reno. One of the ways he got in trouble, by the way, is after Little Bighorn, he became a raging alcoholic who would randomly grab other women,
Really?
especially married women. Yeah, Reno fucking lost it after Little Bighorn.
Well, I mean, it was a pretty terrible thing to live through, though.
Well, he got blamed for the defeat, of course. But I also think like his atrocious behavior afterwards, just that was the nail in the coffin that said, okay, we're gonna blame you, we're gonna kick you out of the army, kind of thing, right? So I just recently read about that one. But anyway, sorry. So the Plains Wars, it's interesting. We talk about and think about that about them, but Sherman and his guys saw it literally as just like a cleanup operation. You know, and compared to the Civil War, they're like, "Oh, this is small potatoes," and they never for a minute doubt that they're going to lose. They never doubt that they're going to win.
Well, yeah, I mean, the
Like,
resources are a little too stacked on one side for any other outcome to be possible.
Yeah, and also what Sherman has to maneuver at this time is between what the peace policy and the war policy. Now, understand, for people today, both policies would be considered horrendous. The war policy, its most extreme would be extermination. There's not enough people calling for that, though. The other thing involved with this would be the hard war policy of Sherman and Sheridan. The peace policy is what Grant favors when he becomes president. Now, that's important to keep in mind. Grant didn't actually favor it when he was commander of the Army after the Civil War, but he favors it once he's president. Now, this is where the Grant-Sherman relationship takes a really fascinating turn. What it is that when Grant becomes president, Sherman is now head of the Army. Now, Sherman wanted as his second in command to be both Meade and Thomas. Grant instead made it Sheridan because that's his best bud. I'd probably say in the Civil War, at least at the end, there's no officer Grant likes more than Sheridan. Anyway, Sherman thinks, I've got a friend in the White House. I'll have a good position here. Not the case. Grant is going to make sure that the Secretary of War, which is William Belknap, who was a fairly successful Union general, is actually the guy in charge. So, whereas Grant, when he was commander of the Army, actually had a decent amount of latitude, a lot of things get transferred from the commander of the Army to the Secretary of War. So, for instance, Sherman, he's the head of the Army, right? He can't appoint commanders. Like, Sherman can't give an order that says, you're now in command of Fort Bliss. Belknap does that. I mean, the position for Sherman becomes practically ceremonial. He does what he can do, such as trying to lobby in favor of officers he likes, like Emory Upton, William Hazen, a few other guys who he thought were like the leading lights of the Army. He dispatches these people on military missions. He supports a move away from French and towards German methods. Or German and English, I would say. Although it should be kept in mind, Sherman actually didn't like the Germans when he visited the place. But anyway,
Yeah,
although Moltke
they
spoke
weren't
to
him.
him.
Of course, they didn't like him.
He liked the English. Oh, gee, what's he descended from?
Oh, that makes sense. Although,
Yeah.
I guess to be fair, England had democratized a lot, so I'm surprised he wasn't too horrified by the state of Britain.
The democracy thing is weird because he obviously fought in favor of a democracy, and he seemed to be pretty revolted by monarchy as well. But that's the thing about politics, though, is that Sherman just kind of keeps out of it and just thinks that this is this messy, stupid thing people do, and I have no interest in it. This hurts him as commander of the Army. But anyway, Sherman's main achievement as commander of the Army is he will get the school set up in Fort Leavenworth to teach tactics. So Sherman does there's an argument. People will argue that Sherman, as commander of the army, didn't do much. I would say, given the position he was in, he did about as much as he could do. But yeah, Grant allowed all the power to go to Belknap. Now, the two reasons is because Grant allowed Sherman to become head of the army, but Grant also knew that Sherman essentially opposed radical Reconstruction and the peace policy on the plains. So the only way to neutralize Sherman is to make sure that Grant's own guy had the power. This is when Grant and Sherman's relationship is at its coolest. They don't even hang out. They don't talk. Now, they don't speak ill of each other, but you can see in Sherman's letters that he is sad and hurt. And he's reacting to it not with rage, but just with, really, I'd say anguish, to be honest.
Do you think part of the reason why Grant may have stripped down the power of the head of the army is because, although he had benefited from it, he realized that having someone as head of the army, say a Halleck figure, made things far too political, for lack of a better term, although in this case it's a military man doing the politicking, but you don't want a head of the army who is over-empowered because of the cult of personality that can engender. Do you think maybe that's why Grant moved towards more presidential control through the Secretary of War?
No, I think it was the policy thing, that he knew that he couldn't stop Sherman from becoming head of the army, right?
Right.
He's his friend. Sherman was the second in command of the army. Sherman's the most popular general. He can't stop that. However, he has to make sure that Sherman doesn't have any kind of power to interfere with his plans. So you strip him of a lot of his basic powers. And keep in mind, this also goes back to my theory that Grant was not like a political buffoon. He was politically shrewd. And he also knew that Sherman was actually a political buffoon. Eventually, Sherman leaves Washington, D.C. Think about that for a second. The commander of the U.S. Army decided to move his headquarters to St. Louis, Missouri, just to get away from it all. And the letters, once again, are anguished. You can tell that he's not reacting to this in anger, but he's hurt that his friend has abandoned him and is pursuing policies that he thinks are stupid. The peace policy was the idea that what we need to do was to put the natives on reservations and then teach them to become good, industrious Christians. People today would call that cultural genocide, for instance. And part of that was the army wasn't allowed on the reservations, but missionaries were. And certain missionaries would have certain things. So one tribe would have Quakers, another tribe would have Catholics, one tribe would have Episcopalians. Like, they actually segregated it by religious faction, if you will. Because all the religious reformers and the people out the East were the ones who believed in this peace policy. Now, Grant will abandon that peace policy in the end of his term in 1876, which that is the catalyst for Little Bighorn, of course. And by the way, the two shocking things about Little Bighorn for people was that everyone died in Custer's command, and also Custer is dead, who by that time is a wildly popular figure. He was in the news a lot. He'd angered Grant. He was obviously angling to become president of the United States. So it is kind of like, you're seeing this rising popular star get killed as well. Anyway, Sherman is politically isolated. He hates the game of politics, so he doesn't even want to play it. So he just kind of is resigned to his fate. Now, when Grant leaves and Hayes is president, Sherman returns to Washington, D.C. He gets to enjoy watching Belknap fall. Because Belknap, to fund his lavish lifestyle, made sure that the army soldiers could only buy from traders who overcharged them. How's that sound?
So basically, it was Halliburton 1.0.
Yep. There you go, man. Like Halliburton, except on the fur trap and trade post level. Sherman drew satisfaction also from the fact that the One of the guys who took Belknap down, the guy who really got the ball rolling, was William Hazen, who was one of his favorite officers at that time. Hazen was one of the most difficult Union commanders, but a great officer, great commander. But he did not suffer fools above or below him, and so he went right for Belknap and took him down. Pretty cool, huh?
Wasn't Hazen another Ohio guy?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know that Ambrose Bierce, the great author, served under him and left a great description of him that I can find. Let me look this up real quick. In the meantime, we got any other super chats right now?
We don't.
Are we all good?
Actually, he's a Vermont guy. But
okay.
He moved to Ohio at the age of 3.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. So he's essentially Ohio.
Yeah, basically Ohio. But with a touch of New England.
All right, pulling it up right now. I love this description of Hazen. General W.B. Hazen, a born fighter and educated soldier, after the war chief signal officer of the Army, now long dead. He was the best hated man that I ever knew, and his very memory is a terror to every unworthy soul in the service. His was a stormy life. He was in trouble all around. Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and a countless multitude of less eminent luckless had the misfortune at one time or another to incur his disfavor, and he tried to punish them all. He was always, after the war, the central figure of a court-martial or a congressional inquiry, was accused of everything from stealing to cowardice, was banished to obscure posts, jumped on by the press, trounced in public and in private, and always emerged triumphant. While signal officer, he went up against Secretary of War and put him to the controversial sword. He convicted Sheridan of falsehood, Sherman of barbarism, Grant of inefficiency. This is good right here. He was aggressive, arrogant, tyrannical, honorable, truthful, courageous, skillful soldier, a faithful friend, and one of the most exasperating of men. Duty was his religion, and like the Muslim, he proselytized with the sword.
God damn.
Ambrose Bierce is amazing sometimes.
I have his Devil's Dictionary. I forget where I put it. I think it's in my office. I haven't had access to in over a year.
Oh, great. So you have no access to your office?
No, they changed the door code. I don't know how the hell to get in there anymore. But
okay.
I still have a few books in there. I need to do that at some point. I guess when I defend, I will ask somebody what the damn door code is and get my stuff.
Well, all right, so getting back to Sherman, he eventually will no longer be head of the Army. Sheridan takes over. Sheridan, by the way, was in bad health and did almost nothing. He's actually one of the worst heads the U.S. Army's ever had. Also, by the time Sheridan takes over, it's all over. I mean, there's nothing much to be done, right? You know?
True.
But I guess what we can say is that whatever reforms Sherman had going, Sheridan really didn't push through any more of those. Schofield will, though. Schofield actually turned out to be a pretty decent overall head of the Army. Anyway, at this point in his life, Sherman becomes a big social butterfly. He likes going out to plays, doing speeches. He's one of the most sought-after dinner orators, if you will. Of course, writes his memoirs, fights battles with other generals over status and reputation. Some of the fiercest ones are over the Battle of Shiloh and being surprised, naturally. He also, at this point, fixes up things with Grant. A lot of that is because he and Grant, their military records were tied together, so if people came after Sherman or Grant, they're coming after both of them. So they kind of bonded over defending their reputations during the Civil War.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, they by the time, and also Sherman visited Grant on when in his last few months, and that was very, very touching for Grant and important for him. So the friendship was patched up after that very difficult time. One of the most interesting things about Sherman at this time too is he becomes notorious for having affairs. There's actually apparently an account where after the war, Grant said, like, well, now the Civil War's over, I'm going to ride horses. And Sherman says something like, well, Grant, you can ride horses, but I'm going to try to kiss all the pretty girls. And he would randomly do that. He would pretend to be absent-minded, though.
So he was either pretending to be like an old demented man, or he would just be like, "Oh, I'm just doing it as a habit. Sorry, didn't mean anything." Unless you want to mean something, or, in which case, my room is 703.
He kissed Hazen's wife. He kissed Hazen's wife, and she was like, "I don't want any." Because he did it once, surprised her. Second time, she's like, "I don't want any of this." And then he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Her description of Sherman's amazing too. She essentially says, like, I wish I'd listened to him more because he babbled on about the war and there was all this great stuff he was saying, and he was really entertaining. He was also totally full of himself and an arrogant ass who hit on every woman he met. What's interesting is that Sherman will end up carrying on two affairs that we know of that were long and intense. One is with the sculptress Vinnie Ream, and the other one was Mary, I can never pronounce her last name, Angenard, who actually was the wife of one of his officers. And when he died, she got with him. What both these women had in common is they were actually strong, independent, intelligent women. They were the opposite of Ellen in many ways. Not that Ellen Sherman didn't have a will of her own. She did, but it was more religious and familial than anything else. And so these women they were younger than Ellen. They could provide a certain kind of intellectual conversation that Sherman craved and that Ellen just could not provide. At the same time, by this time, his marriage with Ellen is at probably its worst state, and then comes what his son Tom does. Tom became a lawyer. He secretly plotted becoming a Jesuit. So Tom one day just goes to his dad and says, well, Dad, I'm going to go join the priesthood now, later. And Sherman saw this as a grand betrayal. And their relationship was never patched together. Should be noted, by the way, that Tom Sherman turned out to be a terrible Jesuit. He was considered incompetent by the order. like really bad. He was an instructor, and they said that when he became a teacher, they said he would ramble on and talk about his family and current affairs.
Oh, God.
Oh, yeah. He got weird, though. After his dad died, he used to actually take his father's uniform, put it on, and parade around the house.
What?
Yeah, he would get drunk, and... Sherman... Sherman's son, Tom, his life was a disaster.
Yeah, because I don't know, what is it that makes you an incompetent Jesuit? I mean, because I know there are Jesuit scholars, so obviously you can be an incompetent scholar. It's not too hard to wrap your head around, but... So he's just failing at basic instruction, or what is it that he's failing at in particular?
Well, he's a teacher, and he just wasn't a very good teacher, you know? Let me see, I'm grabbing Citizen Sherman because it's nearby, and what does he say about him? Okay, he was an unsuccessful teacher at the Jesuit universities of Detroit and St. Louis, unable to focus on the subject he was teaching, rambling on in the classroom about himself and about current affairs, frequently absenting himself to travel about the country, visiting his sisters and cousins. In the 1880s, he became a Jesuit missionary to the working classes, using his name to draw large audiences where he would present the Catholic Church as the only real alternative to the godless anarchy and communism. The vehement extremism of these talks finally so embarrassed the Jesuit order that they shunted him back to teaching.
Damn.
He eventually died in a New Orleans retirement home.
Wow. Yeah, that's, sounds like an odd fellow. I mean, I don't know, I guess I always figure when somebody enters a religious order, it's kind of hard to fuck that up because the code of conduct is so straightforward. You're kind of on this straight and narrow path, so there's not really a whole lot of leeway to really fuck things up. I mean, I can see how some people would succeed way more than others if they're really into it and they have a certain gift for conversion or for being persuasive or whatever it might be, but yeah, to fail in an explicit and conspicuous manner is fairly rare. I guess the only other person I can think of right offhand the Catholic Church really tried to clamp down on for embarrassing them was Father Coughlin.
That makes sense, yeah.
Although they let him go for a long time before they decided to reel him in.
Yeah, no, Sherman. Yeah, so he saw his son essentially, in his opinion, abandon him. They did have reconciliation afterwards, but it's not enough. Fun tidbit about Sherman: when he's getting very senile, he met Robert Louis Stevenson and was convinced it was one of his old soldiers.
What did he write again, Robert Louis Stevenson?
Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Treasure Island, Kidnapped.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty funny. That so Sherman had some sort of dementia or something along those lines.
Just kind of losing it a bit. I mean, if I looked at anybody in their last days, I mean, Grant was battling cancer. Beauregard's last days were interesting. Somebody just became melancholic and absent-minded, and he started telling people like gardening advice when he didn't know how to garden. And that's actually when a lot of the stuff we know about Beauregard's childhood comes from those last few months when he just started reflecting on when he was a boy growing up, in the swamps of St. Bernard or marshy areas of. Sherman, in his case, just becomes absent-minded. His death, by the way, is attended with a massive funeral, and he's buried in St. Louis, Missouri. He could have been buried anywhere, honestly. I mean, this guy lived just about everywhere you can think of. San Francisco, St. Louis, small town in Missouri, New Orleans, Washington, of course, Lancaster, Ohio. He had seen so much of America as well. Of all the Civil War generals, he might be one of the most traveled. And that was kind of something he was into to begin with. So, when Grant's head of the army, Sherman was still the kind of guy who like traveled to far-flung posts, for instance. He went to Texas when they were having problems with the Comanche there. And he wants to go there. He wants to be in the middle of the action. So this is a man who also loved to travel. He's essentially a nomad and a vagabond. I'd probably say St. Louis, though, makes the most sense for him, simply because that's where the family had lived most of their time post-Civil War, at least of any one location. So anyway, so Sherman, it's worth discussing what we think his legacy is, right?
Sure.
I mean, he's one of the most. He's heavily photographed, lots of paintings, iconic and famous commander of the Civil War. Today, of course, the Sherman memes are popular with a lot of people. You know about this, right?
Not too much, actually.
Yeah, I mean, so.
There's the "War is Hell" meme that goes around a fair amount.
Yeah, which is funny because about the "War is Hell" thing. Because if you read Sherman's Shiloh report, it's some real grandiloquent stuff. It's a very like it's always like Charge the Light Brigade poetry in some passages. So I guess he thought war was hell, except at Shiloh it rocks, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends on how much it helped his career. If it helped him get to a high post, then it was pretty cool. Otherwise, the human cost is unacceptable.
Yeah. Well, he could. One of my favorite ones that he said about. Remember, this is a guy who can flip from one thing to another, kind of like Napoleon. You're intelligent, you talk a lot, you think a lot. You're gonna have some disagreement, but I like the one he said. I am sick and tired of fighting. Its glory is all moonshine. Even success is the most brilliant is over dead and mangled bodies, with the anguish and lamentations of distant families appealing to me for sons, husbands, and fathers. It is only those who have never heard a shot, never heard the shriek and groans of the wounded and lacerated, that cry out for more blood, more vengeance, more desolation. My favorite line he ever said is, I think we understand what military fame is: to be killed in the field of battle and have our names spelled wrong in the newspapers.
Wow.
I love that one. That's a good one. So if we talk about Sherman in terms of his military abilities, he's one of the most erratic commanders of the Civil War. Tactically, sometimes called mediocre. I wouldn't go that far. I think he showed some gifts at Shiloh, for instance. But really, tactics weren't his strong suit. It's going to be logistics, logistics, operational maneuver, strategy. The North had a number of gifted strategists, McClellan and Grant, of course. I kind of hold just a personal opinion. I think of Sherman as the best of the group, though. Although all three of them are very gifted strategists. At the same time, there's this idea that Sherman represents a kind of like move towards modern war, the first modern war general. There's some truth in that, but for instance, the kind of operations the Union is doing are not unusual. I mean, hard war operations, burning farms, destroying stuff, that's pretty common. That's not something unusual. A true total war would have been like the mass destruction of towns, and the Union would have shown a lot less restraint than they did. And understand, I know I'm saying restraint. The war is devastating for the South. Economically, it's not going to recover for over 100 years. What I am saying is that it not only could have been worse, the Union policy was essentially targeted. There are, of course, moments where there is wanton destruction. Probably the two biggest ones I can think of is Sherman's march through South Carolina. That got bad. And the Union Bayou Teche campaign in Louisiana in 1863. That also got really bad. So anyway, what was I saying? Yeah. So I think he'd be modern in the sense that he did grasp the importance of factories, railroads, and other things. I'm not saying not before anybody else did. Lots of other people did too. It's just that he did grasp those things pretty early on and could use them successfully. So I don't know about first modern general per se, but he might be modern in the sense that he's definitely not a military romantic, right?
Right.
But then again, read that Shiloh report. I mean, he's talking about how about his men on the second day of Shiloh, like coming up and meeting Buell's men, and everybody's cheering, and the men who used to serve under him in Kentucky in 1861, when he went crazy, they cheered for him and stuff. And it's all very romantic in that regard. So I don't know. He's a complex guy for sure. Lydell Hart wrote what's probably the most laudatory Sherman biography. That's because he believed that Sherman represented what he called the indirect approach. So Lydell Hart's whole idea was that when in warfare, you need to consider things in the indirect approach is the best way to win a war, not the direct approach. Make a case that Hart probably oversold it with Sherman. So I don't know. I'm a bit on the fence about the whole modern general part. I guess he's closer to it than most of the Civil War contemporaries, but I don't know if I exactly put him in that category. That's it. It's I mentioned that Sherman meme stuff earlier. I think what happened is that you have these like Civil War message boards and stuff, and these places are snake pits, a lot of them. All right, and you go in there and try like telling them that whoever their favorite general has had flaws, right? The Sherman memes became popular for people who were like really like, we got to start taking down statues and all this sort of stuff. And I think also as the American South increasingly becomes in the progressive imagination like the ultimate boogeyman of American history, like if not for those damn Southerners, everything would be better. The idea that Sherman burned his way through a lot of the South and had harsh words for them as well is something they get off on, which to me is kind of hilarious because a lot of these people, I mean, Sherman would have no time for them at all. Like, this man's racist by the terms of his day.
Yeah, not to mention that, as you said, not really a big fan of democracy or the, I guess, increase of the franchise. So the causes that they see him as advancing were not causes he'd want to be associated with.
Right, and one could also argue, wait, did Sherman realize what he was doing? But Sherman, I would argue, was a progressive in the sense that he believed in technological progress. That he believed in, like in other words, like his one of the things he really harps on about the natives is that they're incapable of civilization, in his opinion. They can't build great cities, they can't have great art, if you will. That's what he thinks. So he believes he's actually progressing humanity. He just simply sees democracy as a disease, if you will. So Sherman is actually the kind of guy who would totally support a technocracy, I think.
Yes, he might be in league with our friend Michael, at least Michael back in Kentucky.
Yeah, could be.
How about how technocracy is the way forward?
Yeah, no, he's. I mean, the technocrats of today, of course, wouldn't want him around, but for his age, he's a technocrat. I mean, think about it. For the U.S. Army, he's saying we need to move towards more scientific methods. He supported reforms to West Point that were instituted, and of course, there's a creation of the military school at Leavenworth for teaching tactics. Yeah, Sherman believed in human progress. He just didn't believe in democracy, and he also thought progress was solely a European thing, a European American thing. I don't know. By the way, I don't know his opinions on Asians. Okay, so I don't know that one. All right. But yeah, so it is a certain brand of 19th century progressive, for lack of a better term. Keep in mind too that whole thing about technocracy and professionalization, if you will, is a big part of the progressive movement of that age. Because keep in mind, back then, you could just become a lawyer. You know about this? Yeah, like you didn't go to law school.
Yeah, you just had to do an apprenticeship with an established lawyer, and you passed the bar, and then you were good.
I don't even know if you had to pass the bar necessarily.
I think each state did have a bar, but I don't know if there was an official exam. I mean, I think back then it might have just been as simple as if you serve under a certain person and they're willing to go before a court and say this person is now able to be a lawyer. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of process there. But there was some. I see what you mean.
There was some, but not like what we have today.
Right, I mean, it's nothing like today. Although I did learn, because I knew somebody who did a weird program where she got a JD on the way to a history PhD. Apparently getting a law degree is way easier than getting a PhD.
Yeah?
Yeah, so we fucked up, is all I'm saying. Not only is it way quicker, but the classes are not as hard. Workload's not as heavy. Yeah.
Workload can be heavy, depending on what school you're at.
I mean, the law school here is fairly well regarded, and the person I knew who did both said that her law classes were considerably easier.
Okay. Yeah, but so so no, Sherman is that sort of progressive, if you will. So it's hard for me to place him as being either left or right necessarily, which I've already told you. I feel that about a lot of the figures in the 19th century. Like in some ways, like where do I exactly put Jefferson Davis? I mean, he should just be conservative, but if you look at Jefferson Davis within the Confederacy, he aggressively supports universal male white suffrage. And keep in mind, a lot of Confederates don't. Some of them are like, hey, maybe we can repeal that whole universal white male suffrage deal, and he is adamantly against it. So
he's a
in that regard, yeah, well, in that regard, and some other ones too, Davis is not a left winger. Another one thing too, Jefferson Davis does not believe in nullification. He thought it was a stupid idea. He believes in like secession and Southern rights and slavery, but he does not believe in nullification. He thinks that's silly. So so in the case of Sherman, is he really a conservative? Once again, if he has those conservative ideals, I guess you could say like, well, but in practice though, he did free those slaves, even though he wasn't interested in that. right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting discussion to be had. I will say though that he definitely disliked political radicals of any type, and that would be whatever party you are, whatever section you are. And so in that regard, having your arguably your political radicals of today being like, "Oh man, Sherman's so awesome," I'm like, this guy doesn't agree with a lot of what you people believe.
Yeah, if
And
anything, I
he's
feel like he'd just be the guy who he'd sort of be like Colin Powell in the sense that if you actually put a mic in his face, he'll say things that you have to edit out because he's displeased with most everybody. You know, like when they talk up to Colin Powell and at first like, oh yeah, he'll give us a nice level-headed centrist take, and then he says, yeah, you know, Bill Clinton, not a terrible president, but couldn't stop dicking bimbos. He'll just say whatever's on his mind.
that's what Powell said.
CNN worthy. Oh yeah, he just said it. Like he was randomly being interviewed, I think, at a red carpet, and he said, "Yeah, you know, Bill Clinton pretty good. Couldn't stop dicking the bimbos though."
That's quality stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he was retired by this point. His career with the Bush administration was over. I think this was the Obama presidency, so he didn't give a shit about what he said, and he still doesn't. He'll just say whatever's on his mind, no filter, and most of it will just be hushed up if it's not TV worthy.
Gotcha. No, it's I got more respect for Powell now. I mean, I've always liked him, but we'll mention him when we get into the Reagan video.
Yeah. So, I mean, anyway, yeah, I don't think Sherman, because he doesn't really serve anybody's agenda in any meaningful sense today, I don't think that if he were a contemporary figure, he'd have a lot of a following. That being said, if he had a reputation for being a very successful general, I don't think he'd have a ton of detractors either.
Yeah, I gotcha.
You'd just be like, yeah, he's a great general, but let's just not talk to him. Let's go talk to this other guy.
Well, that's the thing is that back then they always wanted him around. I mean, once again, he was one of the most sought-after orators in his last 10, 20 years of his life.
Yeah, I guess the public lecture scene is not what it was. I mean, there's still a lot of public lectures, TED Talks, for instance, and podcasts are basically that too. But, yeah, I feel like I don't know if he'd be one of those guys who gets canceled. I mean, obviously a lot of things that he says would be cancellation worthy, but maybe his military reputation would be just a little too high, and his politics would be a little too idiosyncratic to put him in the limelight of anybody who wants to gain Twitter followers by denouncing him.
What about I mean, you said cancelable. I mean, wait, not the sentiment that in 100 years, the only place you'll see a Native American is in a museum?
Well, that one, if he said that today, then yeah, that would cause a huge fucking uproar. Especially if he were still the head of the army when he said it or something like that. If he said that shit as the head of the army, that would be the scandal of the week or the month, and no matter who the president was, you would see Sherman get dismissed. Or decide to retire randomly. To spend time with his family.
Yes, I spend time with family.
Yeah, spend time with the kids who aren't Willie. The ones who I just kind of try to pretend are actually Willie.
Including the daughters, right? Which,
yeah.
By the way, they're all Catholics. They're all like hardcore Catholics. Like this is hilarious. This anti-Catholic guy has a hardcore Catholic family. You gotta love the Sherman contradictions. But no, yeah, I mean, anybody you'd take from that period and throw them into here, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily work out, of course, right? It is interesting, though, once again, to me, the popularity of Sherman memes. Now that I don't know, you mean now that at this point, people are trying to like get rid of words like antebellum and Dixie, essentially. So at this point, what I guess I'm trying to say is the utility of Sherman memes I would think is eventually just going to kind of run out,
Yeah.
And maybe he does get canceled because, boy, does he have a lot of horrible sentiments, and you have the whole thing with the Indian Wars, if that ever becomes a thing for people. And I'd probably say that's actually probably the group he holds in the most contempt, by the way.
Which group is that? Indians?
Yeah, natives. I think something to do with the Seminole fighting
Yeah.
as well.
I guess there's also some irony in that apparently he and his father had a very different view of the Native Americans.
Yeah, there's the irony that one of the most famous scourges to the indigenous has Tecumseh in his middle name.
Yeah, and then he's the guy who is ultimately the mastermind behind the Indian Wars, which end what's left of Native American independence.
Yeah, so for instance, one of the things he supported was the hunting of buffalo and railroads because he's like, we kill off the buffalo, we put the railroads up there, the natives we finished. He very much was pursuing a strategy that was very much like what they'd done to the South, which is destroy the economy, and that will topple him over.
So I guess it's safe to say that he was not an environmentalist.
Go, God, no. I also mentioned that too because Hazen was like, this is disgusting. We're wiping out the buffalo. He said it's pointless. They're just shooting them. And so Hazen, I read Hazen's account of this. I'm like, God, Hazen, I didn't know you were such a Greenpeace advocate, And eventually Hazen and Sherman had a falling out, and partially it was over that. I don't know if it had to do with him.
To be fair, though, because Sherman, as you mentioned in later years, was sort of a horn dog. A lot of the girls that Greenpeace puts out to advertise and try to gain members, a lot of the girls they put out are pretty fucking hot.
So you're telling me they're body shamers? Is that it?
No, I'm just saying, I've met some of these Greenpeace activists, and a lot of the girls that they have out there advertising for Greenpeace, pretty good looking. One girl got me to sign up, just mostly because I thought she was super hot. Which, that's the only time it's ever happened in my life where I've spent money because I thought the girl selling something was attractive.
Okay.
So, yeah. Anyway.
Oh, funny, man.
Look, sex sells, man. What do you want me to say?
Yeah, always has, always will. So people are like, oh my God, they're photographing these people in this way that's exploitative. I'm like, well, it sells. It's in your genetics. But let's not get into that. Sherman, though, you got any other thoughts on him?
Well, no. I guess let's talk about his legacy a little bit in terms of his enduring name power. So obviously the most famous legacy of Sherman is being the namesake of the M4 tank.
Yeah, you got that one.
Which was built, probably wasn't the most built tank of World War II, or one of. It was very common, very successful.
That or the T-34, right?
Yeah, it's up there. And I think actually there were more Shermans than T-34s, because actually we sent a bunch of them too. So some of their tank groups actually had the Sherman.
Yeah.
The British Firefly Sherman with the upgraded weaponry. And it was the mainstay of the U.S. Army as well, pretty much throughout the entire war in the West. And then you had variants of tank killer versions and whatnot, so that was a pretty big reminder about who Sherman was, some decades after his death. And then, of course, Civil War General 2, one of the great big box PC games of the 1990s. Sherman is on the cover, marching with his men with Atlanta on fire in the background.
Oh, the T-34 was they had more of those built.
Sherman was probably second, though.
Sherman's a lot, like 50,000 of them, but that's M4 Sherman. If you include the variants, then I guess maybe,
Yeah.
Like Sherman Firefly or something. Like you mentioned that was the British one. They put the heavy pound gun on there.
Yeah, I can't remember the poundage of the gun, but it was way better than the shit we were using. I do remember that.
Yeah. Well, I mostly know that because when you're playing close combat, a bridge too far, the Sherman Firefly is one of the only ones that can actually knock a German tank out. It'll blow up a Panther, no problem.
Yeah, I forget what the designation of that gun was, but the U.S. should have just copied it and then started manufacturing it, because that gun was clearly superior to what we were putting on our tanks.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, the Firefly had like only 2,000 tanks roughly built.
That makes
So
sense. I think the British were mostly still using Churchills and Cromwells, and what was the other one? They had Centurions at the very end, and then
yeah,
there was
that's
another
Centurions.
tank they put out too. They also had
Yep.
anti-tank weapons called Archers.
I think it was also the Valentine tank, although I think that it might have been retired by then.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the ones they deployed to Europe, not the North Africa ones, because the Crusader tanks, those were long gone. Um,
Yeah, let me check. No, it looks like they had the.
Valentine sounds correct.
I think they had I think they had some Valentines with them as well, but it was mostly used in North Africa. It looks like. But yeah, no, yeah, everybody. Fun fact: the Red Army did like the Sherman tank. They said it was a good cross country and mechanically reliable.
Yeah.
You know, because a lot of the Soviet stuff, like the T-34, that's one of its problems is they tend to break down actually rather easily.
That's
That
why I
red.
just kept shitting them out. So if one breaks down, rather than fixing it, you just give the crew a new tank and tell them to keep going.
Dude, the Soviets continued that with their Navy. I found out, like they would, the Navy Cold War era. They emphasized like, look, we just got to build a lot of these subs, and a lot of the stuff as the Cold War goes on, they weren't really building the replacement parts to keep it up properly. You know, but anyway, um, yeah, no, it's. I mean, I guess what I would probably say with Sherman, I mean, I don't know if any other Civil War general has as many biographies. I mean, in my lifetime alone, I think 8 or 9 of them have come out. So you have a man who has lots of letters. He is very quotable and entertaining. He's in the midst of controversy. He's there for major events. His life has lots of highs and lows and dramatic moments. And it's a way to talk about so many different things, such as, you know, for on the one hand, we can talk about the Indian Wars, right? Or you can talk about, of course, the Civil War. Or like this book I'm reading, Citizen Sherman, talks a lot about Sherman in the context of the Victorian male ideal and how he felt that he lived up to it and did not live up to it.
Right.
And, you know, that being things like the affairs, for instance, and the problems he had with his family. And I say this because, you know, there are other figures who might be competitive with Sherman in these regards. But, for instance, Sheridan didn't have like a crazy family life. Sheridan's not a bad writer, but he's not a great one. His memoirs aren't nearly as fun. So yeah, I think that's also why you still hear a lot about Sherman. Once again, the Sherman meme's popular, especially for people who are like, you know, ooh, the South.
Right.
Like, thank God they got burned.
Yeah. Also, it's interesting to me that there are some Southerners who very much denigrate the memory of Sherman as if he were a Satan figure. I remember my grandpa was kind of like that. He'd be like, "Yeah, Sherman completely destroyed the South and set us back by 100 years." And then you actually look into what he did. Yeah, not so much. It wasn't that bad. There weren't too many grand massacres. This was not fucking Genghis Khan coming through.
No. There's a lot more restraint being shown, except for that initial push into South Carolina. That's bad. That's some liberal burning there. But no, there's more restraint to it. I think what I would say, though, is that a combination of policies, such as the destruction of the Shenandoah Valley or James Wilson's raid through Alabama and Georgia, all of those are ones where you're going to get a lot of destruction. But Sherman can fulfill that kind of demonic role for the South for a number of years because he carried out the largest of the campaigns. Let's also face it, a lot of the photos, he looks mean, right?
I mean, he's got sort of a scowl going.
Yeah, you wouldn't know that actually the guy we're looking at here was considered by most people to be intelligent, charming, and a fantastic conversationalist. When I first saw a photo of him as a kid, I just thought he was like a villain. Like, immediately, I was like, this is a bad guy.
He's just not very photogenic.
Well, you know, back then you couldn't smile or anything. I think he liked the whole grim visage thing going on, right?
Yeah, also, you never really do see anybody smile. I think part of that, too, is probably because people didn't have very good dental care.
Well, I'd heard there was a whole thing with like photography where you need to be as completely still as possible, and to smile, you'd have to keep it up the whole time.
Right.
Although they did like there was that one movie where the guy said they were like doing a photo thing. It's called like A Million Ways to Die in the West, and he's like, "Hey, have you ever like smiled in the photo?" And he goes, "No, you look like a crazy person."
Yeah. And now, especially in YouTube culture with thumbnails, I mean, most thumbnails are just somebody having an out-of-control smile with their face plastered next to some product that they're talking about.
Oh yeah, God, those are ugly looking.
Yeah, I mean, I hate those so much.
That's disgusting. Yeah, those look terrible, man.
But also, I feel like it was a part of our culture, especially for our generation, especially when we were just coming of age, that it was very much pushed the idea that we should be extremely friendly and super, super goddamn positive, even if that has nothing to do with how our personalities are wired at all. At least I felt pressure that was like how the way that people would be successful was by being ultra positive and lame in that sense, uncritical.
Yeah, well, power of positive thinking had really taken off. I mean, hell, Trump's one of those believers in that. So yeah, there's a whole this whole thing like, yeah, gotta be positive, guys. And we have those kind of movies they would have where it's like, like Rudy or The Pursuit of Happiness. It's for something where the whole idea is like, if you're positive and you just keep working at it, you can achieve anything. It's like, look, it's definitely going to improve some chances here, but there is a place for like depression and things.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So we have one more super chat, and then we also have a random comment I found that I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
First of all, let's do our super chat. It's from Nico Ayanakone for $5. Thank you, Nico. Sean, you mentioned that you were interested in the Titanic a few times. What is your Titanic hot take?
Hot take. Like, what's my one? It's like let's start the daring theory, right? I've gotten two hot takes from a book called The Last Log of the Titanic, which is a book that like it's kind of on the technical side of what was going on, but I thought actually conveyed it pretty well. So, actually, wait a second. Before I go on, my voice is a bit strained. I've been doing a lot of work lately, a lot of tours. Let me go get a glass of water here, and I'll get into the hot take part, okay?
Okay, fair enough. Do you want to take a 5-minute break real fast? I also need to get some water.
Yeah, sure thing. Sure thing. You know what? Yeah. Let's just take a quick 5-minute break. I'm gonna get some water and whatnot. I also do want to finish up my thoughts on the whole like Sherman as villain thing real quick, because there actually were like peaks and valleys in that relationship, and I want to tell you exactly why it happened. But anyway, I'll do that one. We'll do the Titanic, okay?
Sounds cool.
Hey everybody, I'm back. I'll wait for Thersites to get back though before going to the Sherman thing because it sounded like he was interested in my ideas on, or at least like observations I've made about the ups and downs of his relationship with the South, if you will, and his demonification, if you vilification, there you go, vilification, if you will, from what had happened afterwards. Because there actually was a period of time where that was not the case. Fun fact, too, Sherman actually struck up a friendship with a number of Confederate generals after the war. Most famously, Joseph E. Johnston, who went to the funeral uncovered and then got sick and died. Another one actually was John Bell Hood. Sherman and Hood met a few times, and Sherman actually planned to buy Hood's papers, and he got those papers, and the papers were lost for a period of time. Then they were found recently and published by Savis Beatty. So if anybody's interested in General Hood, that's a very important book to use, of course, for any kind of Hood research. I want to say there was another Confederate he started a friendship with too, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, Johnston in particular and Hood as well. Yeah. So anyway, real quick about the Sherman relationship with the South.
Yeah.
The fact that Sherman offered the South generous terms in 1865 and that he was known to oppose radical Reconstruction meant in the South he was actually viewed positively for a period of time. It was his memoirs that made him into a villain because he went on and on about how the South was stupid and silly for what they did and ridiculous, and he had a lot of insulting words for them. And remember, this is Sherman. He doesn't hold back. But a big one was the burning of Columbia, South Carolina. It became a belief amongst the Union that Sherman had actually burned the city. At this point, we're pretty sure he didn't, but the men may have started some fires, and certainly they didn't do that good at fighting the fire, for sure. So Sherman said, I didn't burn it. It was the Confederates who burned it on accident. But then Sherman had to add, but if I had burned it, I wouldn't care. Because he's Sherman. So that led to his vilification, and the fact that the South economically did not recover. And, you know, of course, what people like Sherman, Banks, and Wilson and Sheridan did played a big part in that. But also it's the way economic development is carried out in post-Reconstruction. Government wasn't thought of in a way to where the government was going to fix things. You would do things through subsidies, though. So a variety of southern states, when they were led by Republicans in Reconstruction, did railroad subsidies. And, of course, there were attempts at economic improvements being made. But, you know, so there's a lot of things that go into that. The devastation of the war plays a big part. The fact the government doesn't offer relief to repair some of these things. And the fact that the economic development itself is being done through subsidies. A lot of it is highly corrupt, whether that's a Redeemer Democrat or a radical Republican in charge, as corruption abounds throughout America at that time. I mean, today as well, too. It's a little more overt about it back then. But that said, I can't speak to it too much more than that because I'm not an expert on Southern economic development afterwards. I do remember Dr. Hamilton, though. One time mentioned he thinks that the worst period in American history or something was the American South from 1890 to about 1940. Well, because he's like, look, you know, height of Jim Crow laws, lots of lynching. People are very poor. The governments are like one-party dictatorships, essentially. So very little relief for the poor, lots of racial injustice, and you couldn't even get a drink. This is the height of dryness, if you will. In fact, Prohibition itself is brought about by a bizarre alliance of like Southerners, conservative Christian Southerners, and then like progressive leftists. It's a weird alliance, right? Of course, one of the ways absinthe one of the other weirdest coalitions is the way absinthe gets banned in America is a alliance between wine manufacturers and prohibitionists. They used each other to get absinthe banned.
Isn't absinthe still banned in most of America?
Yeah, they lifted it in 2007 though, and I'm proud to tell you that Louisiana was the first state to make it legal.
Yeah, because I remember trying it when I was there. It's pretty good.
Yeah, I was happy you liked it. You know, most people do not. I taste like black licorice, which I don't want to eat, but apparently I'll drink. But yeah, you liked it. I was actually I was happy about that because I was like, I don't know, man. Whenever somebody drinks absinthe for the first time, I'm always looking at it, I'm like, okay, how's this going to go down?
Yeah, actually, Tina liked it more than I thought she would too, because she normally does not like hard liquor.
Yeah.
So I guess she does like sweet stuff, so maybe that was why. But
Well, keep her away from Malort, whatever you do.
okay.
Okay?
All right.
Keep her away from Malort.
Malort.
But anyway, so that's just I feel like I might want to say something else about him, but I think we've talked about William Tecumseh Sherman enough. Thanks for letting me ramble on about him for over 2 hours, just go over points of his life and personality tics and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sherman
I
is
guess
a man with many contradictions.
I guess closing it out on my end, why do I like Sherman so much? Like, why more than anybody else? I think it is just because he's very entertaining. He's intelligent. There's lots of ups and downs. There aren't really a lot of simple answers. And so I just find somebody like him just personally just fascinating and compelling in a way where other people might be an interest, but, you know, like, yeah, I mean, like, you know, Grant has some interesting stuff. He's got a pretty interesting life too, but I just don't think Grant is quite as compelling, for instance. Or Lee, definitely not Lee, right?
Right.
No, don't get me wrong. Lee has very interesting parts to his personality, his career, and I think in some ways he's actually more interesting general to study than Sherman in many ways. But just none of these guys get beat. Sherman has the ultimate combination, and that's why one of the reasons why they keep making and writing so many damn biographies. There must be one out every 3 to 4 years at this point. People just can't keep away from him. I mean, James Lee McDonough, who's this old Civil War historian, and he's written a book about almost every battle of the Western theater. Like his first one was Shiloh. They did Stone's River. He did a Perryville book at one point, Franklin, Nashville. Even the last book it came out with was a Sherman biography, and that wasn't just it. There was actually 2 of them that came in with a few years of that. So there is no lack of sources you can look into or just biographies to read and just see people have different opinions on them as well. Like I just finishing up Citizen Sherman, which is considered one of the more negative portrayals. So far, it's kind of my favorite though because he really gets into a lot of like personal psychology, and he did a really close reading of the letters, I must say. But anyway, so those are my reasons for that. Thank you for letting me talk. I promise you there probably won't be anything like this for Henry Slocum or William J. Hardy. We're not going to do the Hardy hour, okay?
Yeah, he doesn't seem like a very interesting guy. I've always been interested in Hardy just because I've always felt like there should be more there than there is.
That's what everybody thinks.
Because he was this guy who's offered command of the Army of Tennessee several times, never took it. He shadowed Sherman, but apparently very ineffectively. He was considered to be one of the greatest officers going into the war and didn't really do much. So he's sort of like a draft bust.
In a way, I'll say this, though. There was evidence that Hardy wasn't going to be that great to begin with because Hardy's tactics is just a French manual translated. And he owed a lot of he actually didn't do that great at West Point. He owed most of his position to the fact that Jefferson Davis just liked him.
No.
That's how he got choice assignments when Davis was Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. So yeah, he's essentially just a Davis favorite, really. But anyway, let's get into the Titanic here real quick. Thank you, Nico.
Yeah, Nico.
Well, if you're going to trust the last log of the Titanic, there's 2 arguments. He really goes into how the ship struck the iceberg and how the popular conception of it is not how it actually happened. His argument is that when it hit the iceberg, It didn't get hit on the side, it got hit underneath. And he makes a very compelling case for that. And at this point, I'm finding, at least whenever I do have my little Titanic spells, that people increasingly think that his theory and how the ship hit the iceberg is actually accurate. But that's not the hottest take. The hottest take in that book is that J. Bruce Ismay, the head of White Star Line, is the one who doomed the ship after it hit the iceberg. Because he looks into it and he finds that so here's how it goes. First officer, Murdoch, is the one who gives the orders for the boat to hard to starboard, hard to port, full stop. So the Titanic hits the iceberg. It stops. The engineer reports that the water is actually holding, that the watertight bulkheads are holding. The thing is, the Titanic was built to kind of be its own lifeboat, as they said, that it would be hard to sink. Well, the thing is that they're now stopped. And what he argues is that at that moment when they were stopped, Ismay spoke with Captain Smith. And what he conjectures is that Ismay told Smith, proceed. So the Titanic did start its engines up again after being hit. Within a few minutes, not long after being struck. And that the engineer then reported the bulkheads aren't holding. And that's because if a ship has taken damage in the bow and it continues to move ahead, especially at a high speed, that'll make the damage only worse. And that is not only what happened to Titanic, it's actually what happened to its sister ship, Britannic. Britannic struck a mine. The captain in charge tried to beach the ship and pressed ahead, but in pressing ahead, it caused more damage and the ship sank within an hour. Now, they had a good lifeboat drill and plenty of lifeboats, so relatively few people died in the Britannic sinking, unlike Titanic notoriously not having enough lifeboats. So his argument is that the Titanic, if it had not proceeded at that moment, might have been able to stay afloat long enough for a ship like the Carpathia to come by and get almost everybody off the boat in time, probably. So my hot take is I think he's right. I don't know if it would have stayed afloat that long, but I think J. Bruce Ismay told Smith proceed, and then very soon after that, the engineer says the bulkheads aren't holding. And it makes sense, too. You're trying to keep a ship going with that sort of thing. I mean, another example of that real quick is when the Japanese battleship Congo was hit with, I think it was 2 torpedoes in the bow. They kept on pressing ahead, and the water was forced in there. The engineers, the damage control team couldn't contain it, and then eventually Congo exploded, actually. Taking bow damage on a ship and pressing ahead that way can be very hazardous for your health, at least from the stuff I've read. So there's your hot take. Hope it's hot enough.
Interesting. Another comment that I found interesting is some people were having a conversation about sort of people showing Confederate flags in their yards versus those people have in this household we believe, and then they have a list of values including we believe in science, human rights, etc.
Oh, the catechism.
Yeah. So somebody, Kaiser Konengrotzer, says a Confederate flag is just a right-wing version of a "in this house we believe" yard sign. And I think there's some truth in that. At least there is in recent years. Before that, I think it was more of just a general Southern thing or more of a vague thing. But I think now, in the last several years, especially since the rise of Trump, there's a lot of truth in that.
What if you have an esoteric Confederate flag, like the Hardee flag, the blue with the white dot, or the Van Dorn flag? Ever seen that one?
No.
It's got the crescent moon on it.
I don't know.
It's a weird one.
I don't. Do those appear in yards at random? Because, I mean, the whole point of a yard sign is to make it clear what it's supposed to be. So there has to be a well-recognized symbol or else just, a sign that actually says what it's about.
There was a guy in the Garden District who used to have Robert E. Lee's headquarters flag up. He took that down years ago. And in Tennessee, I've occasionally actually seen Hardee flags. I'm not saying it's common. I'm just saying I have seen them in Tennessee before. Yeah, if you drive around near the Shiloh battlefield, there's a lot of Confederate flags around that one. In this house, we believe. I like what Thomas Frank pointed out about that. That whole catechism says nothing at all about class.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's our next one? Nerve AMV Maker?
Nerve AMV Maker. Do you think the Shelby Foote Civil War trilogy falls into the Lost Cause tradition?
Thank you for the super chat. And also, I saw that one you put on the Distributed stream about Neon Genesis Evangelion. We're not going to get into anime here. I'll just say that I disagree with him. I like it more than he does. So just say that for you for fun. But anyway, have you read the Foote trilogy?
No, I think I might have one of them, but I've never gotten around to reading it.
I think this is a hard one. I don't think Foote is true lost cause because there's a number of things that you're not going to find in there. He's not going to say that, hey, you know, slavery was great or something, or they were like loyal slaves, which is one of the worst parts of lost cause mythology. And he has good things to say about Union figures during the war as well. He doesn't like have anything where he's like, but I think one might say that he was lost cause in the sense that his books are slightly more sympathetic to the South. The South is treated as kind of this tragic thing, like these people fought this war valiantly, but it was for a dumb cause, and it actually was pretty avoidable. And also, Foote very much adheres to the idea that the North's superior resources are the reason that they win the war. To which I say, I'm like, yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable analysis, right? So, I don't know. I kind of view, if Foote is lost cause, and I'm not even sure if he exactly is, a lot of people would say that he is, but if he is, I would lump him with Douglas Southwell Freeman as the most articulate and intelligent version of that mythology. That's what I would say. They represent it at its the best that it can be, is what I would say. With Foote being less lost cause than Freeman, for sure. So anyway, that's just my thoughts on that one. Foote is a very good writer, and I rather enjoy his stuff. And he did his research well too. He didn't get a bunch of things wrong or anything. It's pretty good. By the way, Foote likes Sherman. Likes Sherman in his work. Yeah, he took a liking to Sherman. So there you go. Not every Southerner hated the guy.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing Foote in the Civil War documentary by, what's the guy who does all the documentaries? I'm blanking on his name for some reason. God damn it. You know who I'm talking about, though, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
The guy who does all the documentaries.
Ken Burns.
Ken Burns, yeah. I remember seeing Shelby Foote in that, and he's a very compelling storyteller. He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would be pushing some horse shit like the Lost Cause. I mean, I guess because he grew up in the South, that's why he got interested in it. There might be some resonances here or there in his work. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all.
Well, I think he's not going to be in the he's going to be sympathetic to the South, but not as like, oh, we had this great heroic war for ideals. It's more of like a tragic sensibility in the book. Waste of life, waste of talent in many ways. At least that's what comes across to me. So sympathetic, most certainly, definitely. But understand, like a lot of your Lost Cause stuff that's being written after the war very much has this flavor of like, we were fighting a good constitutional fight and we were right, but hey, we lost. We got to get over it now. So I wouldn't go, in the terms of Foote is not going to be of that variety. But what I would say is if we're going to classify Foote as a lost cause, then we are broadening the definition of the lost cause, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We'd have to also understand that the lost cause mythology does have points of disagreement, which I've mentioned to you before, like, points of disagreement where Are you okay with reconciliation, or are you an unreconstructed rebel? Do you think Jefferson Davis is like a great political leader and misunderstood genius, or do you think without that idiot we would have won the war? You know. So that's just a few thoughts on that one. But yeah, it's I'm not hell bent on one point or the other in terms of Foote's position within the mythology. Yeah, I guess, is Foote really a reconciliationist? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, of course he would be. He was in World War II. That was part of the whole thing, was this idea that, you know, the country had come together after the Civil War, and together we, you know, won 2 world wars and beat the Depression, and now we're United States of America, you know?
Yeah. As somebody said that Foote once said the only true geniuses of the Civil War were Abraham Lincoln and Nathan Bedford Forrest, which is a pretty odd pair to compare.
Well, that's kind of like, I mean, I say as a joke, I say as, no, not really a joke, but I'll be like, look, the 2 greatest musical geniuses in human history are Ludwig van Beethoven and Prince, okay? Which I'm not entirely joking about, but you get my drift. But all right, so yeah, he did say that. Well, yeah, Foote had a very, very positive opinion of Grant. I think in the case of Forrest, he found just to be a compelling character, and he is, you know. Forrest, never a dull moment.
Yeah.
And also, I think he was impressed with Forrest because, you know, the Forrest is this whole thing about, like, he's unlettered, right? Like, he didn't go to school for this stuff. And he turns out to be this very effective cavalry commander. Now, a guy like Foote probably overstates Forrest's effectiveness. We've talked about how Forrest had, you know, strengths and weaknesses. Sorry, let me see.
Yeah, not much of a scout.
Oh, sorry, say again? Yeah, not that great at scouting. What else? Yeah, not great at scouting. Does not work well with others. Beyond division most he can command really is a division probably. Beyond that, he kind of starts to break apart a bit. Not that he can't do effective as a cavalry corps commander, but I found Jeb Stuart more consistent. So yeah, you know, Foote's not going to pick up on that sort of stuff. But also, Foote is telling a narrative of the war. He's done a very good narrative in terms of like the prose style. But you are not reading Shelby Foote for hardcore military analysis. This is not like reading How the North Won or Retreat to Victory or fuck, dude. You want to really get into the nitty gritty? Sure. What's his name? Earl J. Hess has like 2 whole books on Civil War fortifications. You know?
I imagine most of them were never really assaulted.
It's really good research, but it's only if you're like a super nerd expert person, right?
So you wrote it for an audience of dozens.
I was one of those dozens, sir. I was one of those dozens.
Of course you were. I mean, do you remember that time that you were doing your research for that naval game on the Pacific?
Yes.
With the rulers, and then I told Michael, because I'd been over to your place and I'd seen your stack of books. And by the way, like, for context, the guy we're talking about was the most nerdy of our group of friends. He's like, I don't know, I just don't know how to say it, but that is just so nerdy. Talking about what Sean was doing.
I do want to respond to something real quick, because Stanley here is mentioning Bruce Catton being better than Shelby Foote. If you're talking about the Army of the Potomac trilogy, you are absolutely correct. Beautiful piece of work. However, I wrote a paper on this for Mellish in her class, that Bruce Catton later on, I think, declined. Like, the books weren't as well... I mean, they were still well written, but they weren't, like, masterworks. And that same regard he had for soldiers, that was so... It's that puts you right in the soldier's shoes, like Stanley's saying, is missing from Grant Takes Command. In fact, anything in Grant Takes Command, soldiers are just little cogs and machines. You know, I don't like the book Grant Takes Command. And also, Grant Takes Command was not a very deep bit of scholarship. And at this point, a lot of his contentions in that have been proven wrong. I mean, like some of the details of it, right? Like in other words, instead of looking at every source for an incident, like, okay, there's a famous little story where when Grant goes to Chattanooga and he first meets Thomas, Thomas receives him very coolly and doesn't even like give him food or drink. And then officers have to mention it, and then Thomas responds to him. That story was written by James Wilson in like 1914. If you look at the more contemporary accounts, nobody mentions that at all. Catton reports the Wilson story because it's the more dramatic one. But he didn't look at the other ones and say, like, hey, you know, other people remember this meeting differently. You're not going to get that with Bruce Catton. So don't get me wrong. Love the guy. Very good historian, superb writer. Hard for me to choose between them, but I guess I'll say I like Bruce Catton more than Shelby Foote. But that's because the Army of the Potomac trilogy is just a classic. Superb piece of work.
Oh, while we're still somewhat on the Civil War subject.
Oh my God! Somebody's mentioned the Forgotten Soldier. Oh God!
I mean, I've noticed that you have a fascination with complex people. So, what I want to ask you, Sean, you have a choice to go on a pub crawl, but you can only bring along one companion. Your choices are Richard Nixon, Sherman, and Napoleon. Which one do you take with you on the pub crawl? And you get to talk to this person all night. Obviously, you're going to get drunk, and this person will reveal many of his deepest secrets and thoughts to you because you're very good friends and you're going to go out for a night of drinking and hanging out. So which of those three men do you take with you?
Oh, Napoleon.
Yeah, I think I'd take Napoleon too, but mostly just because he's the most important of the three.
Well, the reasons for not taking the other ones is okay. I mean,
Nixon was weird sometimes.
Yeah, Nixon's weird. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would do it, right? But also, I know that like Nixon can be very disagreeable. So yeah, Nixon, I think, could be a very unpleasant experience, right? And Sherman wouldn't be bad. But sometimes I feel like Sherman would just want to just do all the talking. Okay. And also, I don't know how Sherman was around alcohol or anything. That said, I don't know. I want to see wasted Napoleon. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, it'd be like, look, man, if this one general had been better in Russia, fuck, we would have won the whole war. I'd have conquered all of Russia. Everything would be different now.
Sherman's not bad competition, though. I'll say that. He's not bad competition, but no, man, like Nixon, no, not doing Nixon. I mean, between those three. Yeah. That's the thing, too. I feel like a night with Sherman could also possibly go wrong for various reasons. I feel like Napoleon, no, it'll be fine.
Yeah. Also, somebody had a good follow-up question. Would Massena be considered the Sherman of Napoleon's Grand Army just based on his looting?
Based on his looting? Oh, God. I don't know, maybe.
Well, I feel like Massena was more of a... Well, no, I guess Sherman became a ladies' man after the war, but Massena was already one during the war.
Yeah, the thing about Sherman, too, is that, I mean, he's not really looting for himself, right? I mean, actually, there are rules that say you can't have loot, and they would make sure you didn't have loot. Like, in other words, like, if you're a Union soldier and you come back with some food, cool. If you come back with, like, a nice clock, that's going to clog a wagon up. So that's the kind of thing they'd be like, get rid of that junk. So I'm not saying people didn't take souvenirs, of course, but the kind of souvenirs they're going to take are going to be like, money or like a lock of hair or something like that. Not, lots of loot.
Yeah. Also,
so this is not a proper looting expedition in the French style.
Yeah, somebody has a great Nixon quote from Futurama. Flabby, pasty-skinned, riddled with phlebitis, a good Republican body.
What the hell? Who did a good Republican body? This is weird, man. Tonight's getting weird.
No, Futurama, they did some weird stuff with future Nixon.
Oh, that's right. He had the Nixon in the head jar,
Yeah. I think they also had head jar Spiro Agnew, and they also have the head jars of the other presidents, but none of them became politicians.
Did any of them talk? Like, did they just have Gerald Ford have
Oh
a
no, they all
scene or
talk.
something?
Yeah, I mean when I think Fry and some other characters visit the head jar museum, all the presidents talk to them, or at least the major ones. But
All
only
right,
Nixon's
nice.
not there because he's out being the actual president again.
Before we close things up, you ready for Gerald Ford next week?
I am. I'm ready to drive a Ford next week.
Ready to drive forward? All right, I'm reading up on it. It's some interesting stuff so far. I'm happy we're doing a full episode on him, just because I didn't want to shortchange the guy. I know it's a short presidency, but he deals with some crazy stuff in that short time.
Yeah, I mean he's an interesting figure for sure. And
Oh, we got another super
we
chat.
do from Rocco Aguirre for $9. Thank you, Rocco. How would you
Thanks.
compare Sherman's campaign in the South to Caesar's conquest of Gaul? I mean, I personally wouldn't. I don't think that
Yeah,
they're very comparable.
Yeah, for one thing, what can we say? Sherman's campaign was freeing slaves, and if I'm not mistaken, Caesar was making a lot of slaves, right?
Yeah, I mean, Caesar claims he killed 1/3, enslaved 1/3, and left the other third free in Gaul, which is probably a pretty big exaggeration, I'd have to imagine. But the Romans did like to take slaves when they would compel large armies to surrender.
Okay, yeah, I mean it was probably a boast, but that's also one hell of a boast, right? Being
Oh,
like,
it
hey,
is.
like we killed about a third of them, guys. I mean, whew, that's rough.
Yeah, I mean it's a hell of a boast, but at the same time, it was to show the other Romans how great he was, because he's like, yeah, you know the Gauls, the people who once sacked our city a few hundred years ago, I fucked them up thoroughly. They will never be a threat again. I genocided the shit out of them.
Exactly, because they were the boogeyman of Rome because they had conquered, they'd taken the city at one point, and the famous Victus incident with the who's the Gallic chieftain who said that they were like weighing the gold out or something.
That would be Brennus.
Yeah, Victus. But no. What was I going to say though? What's a better comparison? What's a better comparison is not Sherman's march to the sea. It's the war with the indigenous is a better comparison to Gaul. It's not the same thing, but that is a more fruitful comparison to make. Is the Plains Wars.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. Although, of course, Caesar's conquest of Gaul had much higher stakes than the Plains Wars, at least in terms of the threat to the state which sponsored the conquest army.
Yeah, definitely.
Although, I mean, of course, for the Native Americans, the stakes were really high in the Plains Wars. But the Gauls had an actual chance, so that there's a big difference there.
Yes, there exactly in that regard. Yeah, well, I see what you mean. Like the stakes, of course, are of the absolute highest for the losers in both conflicts, but the possibility of defeat is there with Caesar.
Yeah, whereas with Sherman's generals in the Indian Wars, even if they were to face a catastrophic defeat like Little Bighorn, you only really need, a few hundred more soldiers to fill in the ranks and you're good to go. And it's not too hard to find that.
You know the biggest problem the U.S. Army had was desertion. And most of the soldiers who were actual soldiers are not Civil War soldiers. They were like a lot of Irish immigrants who were coming over to America were joining the army, and the U.S. military at that time had a desertion rate of like 10%. Because discipline was rough, pay wasn't good, and you'd find yourself in some like far-flung outpost. And keep it in mind too, another problem too is the U.S. Army in California during the Gold Rush had a desertion rate of like 30 or 40% because soldiers were just like, why would I be in the army when I can go get gold?
Yeah.
Right? So, ever saw the TV show Deadwood?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I got Deadwood. This is great. One of my favorite TV shows. So this is a great scene because the whole thing's set with the aftermath of Little Bighorn. Anyway, the U.S. Army comes in led by George Crook. Great stuff. When they leave Deadwood, some of the soldiers just like stay by and desert, and they like yell at the soldiers as they leave and make like offensive sexual gestures to insult them. It's the best desertion scene ever. But yeah, so U.S. Army, they were losing more men from desertion than they were from the actual combat that was going on. So that was a big thing with the U.S. Army at that time. Oh, there was something I want to say too about it. Yeah, man, being sent to these far-flung outposts, right? Just in the middle of nowhere in some cases. So yeah, no, the results are never in doubt in that regard.
Yeah.
It also doesn't help that you're now facing an America that's energized and ready to go. I want to conclude with that. There's an argument to be made that in some ways the Civil War was really a war over the fate of the West. Like, how would the West be developed? You know, with the whole thing about the Missouri Compromise being rescinded, so then you have popular sovereignty. And so really, as soon as the war is over, the Americans are looking to defeat the Plains Indians with a renewed vigor. And then you have military commanders who have experience and are going to apply the same overall strategy to the Plains Indians that they did to the Confederates. So anyway, that pretty much calls it quits for me.
Same here. All right, well, that went pretty well. At least we didn't have any pissed off Hancock fans showing up after what I posted yesterday.
Wait, the Graham Hancock thing?
Yeah. Well, actually, usually it takes them a couple months to find the video that I posted about their hero before they really start pouring in to, vent their hatred and their anger.
Do you think the Sherman Hate Club will show up?
I don't know. Is there a Sherman Hate Club?
I mean, I get there has to be. I actually have a Sherman polo shirt that I got his birthplace. It's very comfortable. And I went on a Civil War tour in Nashville, and I kind of had a feeling the guy was going to be a lost causer, and he was. And I had it on. I don't think he was too happy about that. But I don't want to talk a lot of trash about Ross. He's actually been very helpful in the Nashville book I wrote. So, say what you will about him. Nobody's helped me out with the Civil War book as much as Ross Massey. So thank you very much, sir.
Wait, so you showed up to work, do research or something, and you thought this guy might be a lost causer, so you said, fuck it, I need this guy's support, but here's some Sherman, suck it.
Sorta.
Okay, well, that's a bold approach.
I don't know. I don't know, man. I was just like, I don't know. Sometimes I know this is a risk, but sometimes I'm just like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to wear my Sherman shirt. Here's how he took a look at it. I could tell he didn't like that. But when we kept talking, I was just very asking questions. And I think just my own guess for him, he's like, oh, well, this guy's into the topic. He's going to write a book about it. He cares. This is, take what you can right now, right? Maybe or something. But, yeah, so okay, what was I thinking? God, I don't know. I've been up too late. I've been up too long today. But no, there was yes, I go in there rolling out with the Sherman shirt. That's it. So when we get to Mount Olivet Cemetery, it has a thing called Confederate Circle, which is where a lot of the Confederate dead from the Battle of Nashville are buried, including General Thomas Benton Smith. Thomas Benton Smith's very interesting, by the way. He, at the Battle of Nashville, he surrendered. And one of the Union officers who had seen his friend get shot and was drunk beat him with his saber and caused brain damage. And Smith progressively lost his mind over time. He would have sudden violent episodes. And I got David Powell, who's a great Civil War historian, to write a little piece about that for the Nashville book when it comes out. But anyway, when we get there is a tree, and he has a thing nailed to it that says the Thomas Benton Smith tree. And I was like, wait, what's a Thomas Benton Smith tree? And he's essentially well, that asshole Sherman's got that big tree named after him in California. So I just named a tree after a Confederate general I like. And I thought that was some funny shit. I liked it.
Wow.
So no, Ross is great. He's been of immense help, and the guy knows Battle Nashville really well. He wrote a whole guidebook for it. That's a good one. If anybody ever is in Nashville and wants to see some of the sites, and him and the other people over there in the Preservation Society have saved some little pieces of the battlefield. Sure, it ain't much, but we've got some stuff.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's interesting. I didn't know there were any people who were kind of into the lost cause who were still holding down major positions in the Civil War preservation arena.
Oh, definitely, because they I mean, I'm not saying there's a ton of them, but I mean, these people still have the passion for it. Now I'm of the opinion that interest in the Civil War is going to be, it's already low. It's going to get even lower and lower. I mean, attendance at Gettysburg is something like 85% less than it was in the 1970s.
Damn.
So whatever battlefield preservation we've been able to do, and they actually consider the 1990s the golden age of battlefield preservation, not of park creation. I'm talking about just saving land before it gets ruined. I'm kind of convinced that whole the bottom's going to fall out on that. So if you disagree with these people, they're all coming together to try to save what they can where they can. And the smarter ones have to realize that current trends do not favor being able to save more stuff. And I have to wonder about some of those Nashville battlefield sites. I mean, they're kind of some of them are maintained by the Sons of Confederate Veterans. How much longer do you think that organization has?
I don't know. I don't feel like their future's probably too bright, though.
No, and look, it's Sons of Confederate Veterans don't run around doing political stuff. You know what I'm trying to say? It's I mean, of course, they're almost everybody in that group is going to be more of a lost cause persuasion, right? But this is not a political pressure group. These are guys who they have dinners, they have Civil War talks over, and then they try to save some stuff, right? But just having that on your thing is much more of a stigma now. I mean, we've removed stuff in New Orleans, statues and street names are going to be moved because the people's names on them happen to have also been members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I will say one of the worst things that happened last year was when the UDC building was destroyed in Richmond, Virginia. Because that thing had archives and artifacts. And I'll never forget, Mother Jones, being the, shit rag it is, reported that memorabilia had been destroyed. And you realize the language game with that. If you say artifact sounds something like good and reverence. Memorabilia sounds like something nerds collect for Star Wars. Okay? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, hey, however you feel about whatever's going on, the destruction of that building meant the destruction of archives to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which means you can't do research on certain things because, those archives are gone. And things like, the flag that Stonewall Jackson was under when he was shot was in that building. It's gone. It was burned. That is lost. Right? And, so anyway, that's all I'm saying. It's you make what alliances you can to save what you can, and that's even more important right now when the destruction of actual historical artifacts is passed off as memorabilia. So, I'm going to be calling it quits, probably try to finish this Citizen Sherman book and get to bed. Thank you very much. Thanks for letting me ramble on about William Tecumseh Sherman.
Yeah, man, that was good. All right, well, thank you for everybody for tuning in as well, and we will see you next week when we discuss the presidency of Gerald Ford. Until then,
get ready.
Get ready. It's going to be a wild ride because Gerald Ford, famously the most controversial president of all time. All right. He
actually did make what I think is one of the top 10 most controversial decisions ever, which was pardoning Nixon.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, the big event of his presidency. But
Yeah.
anyway, we'll get into all that next week. All right, so everybody have a good week, and we will see you next Sunday. Same time, same place, all that fancy stuff. So good night and good luck. And we're off.